Okay, folks, the fifth meeting of the 24th Council will close this evening. If you would, join us with a moment of silence. Thank you. Join us in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Juro fidelidad a la bandera de los Estados Unidos de América y a la república que representa una nación bajo Dios, indivisible, con libertad y justicia para todos. Thank you. Thank you all. Before we get to tonight's business, I do want to extend a special welcome to our new City Councilor, Lancina, from the 1st District. Welcome aboard. We're so happy to have you. So, can we put you on the spot and say anything?
Or? Thank you to my fellow councilors, and a special thank you to the mayor for this appointment and this opportunity, and for trusting me and continuing the work for District 1. And special honor to the late Ken Sanchez. I want to honor his memory and hope to continue his work. So thank you.
Well, welcome aboard, and you picked a meeting to get started with for sure. Folks, you know, tonight's City Council meeting may look a little bit different than normal. Every councilor is present in person, doing the work of our city and for the people that we all serve. This last week has really been a trying one for everybody, not the least of which includes the legions of city staff, including our own, who've been called on to take on all kinds of new duties, to find some creative solutions to unexpected problems, and they've done that each and every day with exception. We should never be surprised when city workers rise to that challenge, but we do want to acknowledge and say thank you. And so for those of you following along at home, if you see a city worker out doing work, whether it's a first responder or whether it's someone working in our community centers, ensuring that those are clean for our kids, or in the airport, being sure that they're clean and available for those that do have to travel, please extend a special thank you and appreciation for them who do that work. Oftentimes here at work while others have the opportunity to stay at home, and maybe they should as well. So we do want to acknowledge and say thank you to that. Tonight's meeting, as we mentioned, is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to take this out of the top so that we can move through it in response to the governor's declaration of a public health emergency and ban on public gatherings, tonight's city council meeting will be limited to in-person attendance only by the city councilors, council and administration staff, and credentialed members of the media, and we have several of those here with us. Members of the public have the opportunity, like always, to view our proceedings online, both through Comcast Channel 16, online at GovTV, and now for the first time through YouTube. We also have been working to ensure that if you would like to review more of what happened tonight, you can do so online. All of our meetings are archived and available, and our staff is available to assist you if you'd like to come in and make an appointment if you don't have a computer or access of your own. Members of the public can also follow us tonight and always online through the city's social media platforms, including on Twitter and Instagram. Tonight's meeting was posted on the City Council website by 5 p.m. on Friday, as required by the state's Open Meetings Act. And although it's not required by state law that we take public comment, it's been our practice for years to do so. And we went out of our way to ensure, and appreciate our staff in particular for finding a way to ensure that we could do that. Normally, we would let anybody who appeared in person at the city council meeting sign up for comment to speak on an item on the agenda. In this case, we allowed anyone who emailed us, who phoned our office, or who used our online web form to submit public comment on any item on the agenda. I know we've received hundreds of comments over the weekend on all types of issues. We'll have a chance to talk about more of those, but as our staff has put together, we have a large packet of public comment that will be available for inspection, and it's been available for counselors in their emails today, in notes, and also here in person if you're looking to refer to one. And so we appreciate the public's participation in this process. It's not any different than when you would walk in and sign up to speak. It's only that we're putting your words in writing and hanging on to them for the record instead. With that said, and a few strange things handled, we want to begin, if I can find my, here we go, with proclamations and presentations. And first, we want to invite the administration to give us an update on the issue of the day, a little bit regarding the city's coronavirus response, where we go, what we've done so far, and what we have in place to help our constituents and residents. Ms. Nair?
Sure. Thank you, Councilor Davis, and thanks to you and to all the counselors and to your staff, especially Steph and Crystal and Chris, for working with us through all the unexpected issues that have come up over the past week that feels like a year. We have been updating the public pretty continuously, so we thought one shortcut to keeping everyone updated was to give you a packet of the recent press releases, and so if you haven't already got them up there, then we have them for you. We also have a dedicated webpage on the city website. It's www.cabq.gov/, I think it's Corona info, but I'll get the exact one for you. And so that is the place where we are keeping it constantly updated in terms of closures and any other rules that may apply. Since we had the public health emergency declared last year, last week, we've taken a few steps to keep the public safe. One is to change some of our operations. So our senior centers have limited access. They are doing meal-related activities only. Our family and community centers, we're trying to strike the balance between the fact that a lot of people don't have the luxury of staying home with their kids, and their kids are not in school right now, with the need to keep our staff and our folks safe. So what we did was to create 7:30 to 5:30 programming in each of our community centers. You had to be pre-registered. The registration cap was 45 people, so we were staying well under the guidelines for mass gatherings, and we're actually promoting good practices with respect to infectious diseases in those centers as well. So hopefully kids are coming out a little better equipped than they went in. And so those are some of the major changes in operations. The biopark is closed. We had it open over the weekend for outdoor only, sort of a last hurrah for people who are getting ready to hunker down. Those are now that is now closed. The museums and other cultural facilities are in that same position. So again, the website is the best place, and if you click actually on any page on our website, there'll be a place to do the coronavirus page. So today, we also took actions with respect to staff in accordance with the governor's direction to limit operations. We had already been working on it. We basically put employees into a couple of categories. If you can telework, we have you teleworking. If you're remotely dispatched, so all of our public safety personnel, as well as our inspectors and carpenters and folks who are keeping our facilities safe and clean, then we have you doing that remote work because you're not in that front line of lots of people. And then if you are essential, you are reporting to duty. Your director has some flexibility about how and where you do that if you're essential and you cannot telecommute. And then the final category is we did have some non-essential employees who could not telecommute, mostly because they have customer-facing jobs in some of our facilities, and they are just at home on paid leave. We've also, for the last week, had a policy in place that allows our employees to basically call in sick if they have symptoms, or if they present at work and need to be quarantined, or if they are within those travel restrictions. Anybody in those categories who's basically home because of coronavirus, they're getting administrative leave, paid leave, as opposed to having to burn their sick leave. Because we know that when, if we're putting employees in the position where they can present and the supervisor can say, you better go home, we couldn't also make them burn their sick leave for that. So that's sort of where we landed on personnel. We also got a number of questions in advance of the meeting, so if you'd like, we can just start to have those brief presentations from some of our directors.
If that's Councilor Harris.
I have one question. I got an email from somebody who gave me some information. It was about the county declaring an emergency, I guess, and whether or not the SBA would do some things. Once a declaration is made by the U.S. Small Business Administration will begin offering designated states and territories low-interest federal disaster loans. Okay, so is this better? Okay, so I got an email from somebody that said that the county can make a declaration and then the Small Business Administration will offer low-interest loans or something. I'm not sure if that applies to a city, but could you look into that and get back to me, either before the next meeting or at the next meeting?
Yes, Council President Davis, Councilor Harris would be happy to look at that, and that is really the purpose behind everyone's emergency declarations, are to get access to those resources.
Great. And Madam Councilor Harris, is that enough? Is it okay? Madam CEO, I know, some councilors had some early questions. If it's okay, I think we'll let them ask them, because I know you have some ready to go, if that's okay. And I think the first I know of is Councilor Bassans, if that's right. Did you have a question about youth? And I did. I'm sorry, Councilor Borrego. No, she asked the same one you're going to ask.
So my question was with regard to children and the information that parents should be giving to their children regarding this, I mean, especially in these kind of sensitive times, and how, I guess there must be somebody that can address that from one of our departments.
Council President Davis, Councilor Borrego, I'm going to invite our Director of Environmental Health, Ryan Mast, up to the podium to answer that question. And just by way of preface, he joined us from Emergency Management and Resilience in New Orleans, and couldn't have come at a better time because he brings a lot of experience in disaster situations. So, Ryan?
Yeah, thank you. President Davis, Councilor Borrego, thank you for that question. I think it is really important right now that we consider how our young people are experiencing this as well. And there are a lot of proactive steps that we can take and that parents can take as they're communicating this to the young people. I'll go through a few of them here, but there's additional information we can provide, and we'll start putting out additional information to the public as well. And for the most part, one of the key things is to speak to your children or your teens in a way that they understand. Use simple terms that they can understand and speak to it in their language, as opposed to just regurgitating what's being put out in the public. You're going to know best how they can, what words they understand, what terms they understand, what the concepts that they understand. So start with that and make sure to keep it simple. Also, make sure to reassure them that they're going to be okay. And that it's okay, but make sure to validate that it's okay to be a little scared or to have some fear in this time. But just kind of provide that reassurance that there are steps that they can take. Make sure as you're limiting your exposure to the public, you're also limiting a little bit of that exposure to all of the barrage of information that's coming in over social media, over the regular media, et cetera, because a lot of that information comes in and it can become very overwhelming and very confusing. So make sure that you're also taking a break from some of the continuous coverage that we're having right now so that not everything is about this. And then finally, kids, especially young children, are very used to routine. They get the routine in their daily schedules. They get the routine at school. So now that they're not in school, make sure to also start to create those routines at home. That's going to help alleviate some of that stress. It's going to put them back into these cycles that are normal to them. And then you can also have more of those conversations. So those are some tips to use, and they've proven very effective in all sorts of emergencies. But I will continue to push out additional messages on that.
And Mr. President, thank you for that. I would love to see that on the city website, some of the tips for dealing with children, because I lived through the 60s when we had the atomic bomb threat, and I mean, my family still has a shelter at the bottom of one of our pump houses. So I think it's important that, the information and parents, of course, they're going to be sensitive to their own children, but I think it's important that we have some tips for them available on our website as to how to talk to their children if they do see it on TV or something.
Absolutely, we will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next up, Councilor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Actually, I have several questions. So the first question I have is regarding planning. I heard from a couple of people over the weekend and even today concerned about access to the services provided by planning, contractors, developers.
Mr. President, I'm sure these are, can you all hear me? Yeah, can, okay. Mr. President, Councilor Gibson, and members of the council, the planning department counter, if you will, their permit counters and the work that are done by our folks to review plans remains open. And so work continues as best as we can as it relates to the number of people that we have in the facility. In part of our downsizing and of some of these buildings because of the order from the governor, we made a special, if you will, consideration to ensuring that those services remained open. So the counters are open for plan review and inspections. We have moved all our code inspectors out of the building and put them in a field status, which basically means that they report to their supervisor vis-a-vis computer or phone, and then go to their respective vehicles to do their work in a remote fashion so that we can continue to have that service out in the community. So it may be, we may have some, if you will, issues where someone may not have all the information, i.e. at the desk, but we will work diligently to ensure that our programs for inspections and plan checks and reviews continue to stay open and operational.
So thank you for that. So then it sounds like that there were some folks who were deemed I hate to say non-essential, that were able to stay home or possibly work from home. Although in a lot of those jobs, it does really require a face-to-face. So the people who had been working at the counter and helping with permitting and that type of thing with maps, how many of those are not coming to work? What kind of an adjustment had to be made there?
Mr. President and Councilor Gibson, the counter employees that actually work the counter are all still there.
Okay.
Where we made some adjustments were on, for example, the HR department, for if you will, or personnel in the department that can work remotely. The finance folks, they can do remote work. Some of the planners, they can do some of their work remotely, and that is obviously through their computer, et cetera. But for the most part, all of the folks that deal with the public are still there today working the counters. And so, again, we should not see a big impact on that work.
Okay, thank you. And if I may, one more? Actually, this is for Ms. Pierce, Director Pierce. The question I have for you is regarding the early Head Start in the home-based program, the center-based program. How much of that continues to run, and what changes did you have to make?
Great. President Davis and Councilor Gibson, all of our child development centers were operational today. So I have the numbers, and in some centers, 0 children chose to participate, and the max, I think, was 12. So just to give you a little picture what we've done. So we had our leadership, including myself, visited every child development center personally today. Number one, to thank them for their public service, because some of those are located in APS schools and they were open. Some of them are portables on APS campuses, which are City of Albuquerque portables, but they were open. Some of them are in other locations. What we talked about with our staff is talking about the essential service that they provide. All of our community, our child development centers are always following best practice from the get-go. They have the red signs in the front about cough or if people have traveled. We are singing the happy birthday song. Kids start the day washing their hands. They're washing their hands every step of the way. I think they're really the leaders in hand washing. We also then ended our day with an hour-long conference call connecting all of our staff to talk about how the day went and concerns. So all of our staff know that if they have a chronic health condition or if they had symptoms, you know, they're working through their supervisor, they're not providing care. Mm-hmm. We had some really good problem solving about what we can do to adapt, because all parents sign in at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. We're changing those procedures. We've got hand wipes and working on not sharing that pen. And that was one example of a really great conversation at the end of the day. All those child development centers, they're receiving a hot meal through our contractor, and that continues to be provided. So overall, I think they're open. Home visiting services have paused at the moment, and that is because most parents are not really interested in having somebody come in their home at this time, and that's where that one-on-one care happens. Our funders, including the state and Early Head Start, have been very flexible. You know, we are driven by rigorous guidelines. We are still keeping children very safe following those, but when it comes to our enrollment, which we have kept in tip-top shape, they understand right now that there's a little bit of flexibility, especially when it comes to home visiting.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for doing all that.
Thank you.
I have one more, if I may. Or do you, we
That's
can
okay.
take a break.
Can we take Councilor Borrego on that same point, and then we'll come back to your final
sure.
question? Councilor Borrego?
Actually, mine is actually for Carol, and I just wanted to, as I drove by the park and saw so many homeless people, I'd like to know how, because I read that, you know, we're trying to allow them the opportunity to, if need be, to get tested as well, and I just wondered how that works. So if we could maybe have
Thank you, Council President Davis and Councilor Borrego. Yes, over the weekend, I appointed a medical director for the West Side Emergency Housing Center, and her name is Laura Pajaron. We're very fortunate, I think you've heard me say many times, that since May, we were offering on-site health services. And Laura Pajaron, Dr. Pajaron, is one of those providers from UNMH and the Medical Reserve Corps. So she's very familiar with our operation. So I received the advice from Department of Health on Saturday morning that if I wanted to expedite testing, I would be best off having a medical person ask for that. I immediately appointed her. She accepted the appointment. Today, I learned that then we, the city, needed to go back to Department of Health to ask for that testing equipment. We have done that, and our partner, Department of Health, is on that. So we spent the weekend working with a team of people to have our process set for that testing, which includes having a place for isolation. It includes starting with pre-screening on the symptoms and taking a temperature and asking a series of screening questions. We've got a place out at our emergency housing center where people can be isolated, both a pod and separate areas. Right now, we were able, through our partnership with AFR and our emergency supplies, is to secure all the protective gear that is needed for people caring for people who would ever test positive. That includes being tested with the N95 mask, and we're working on that with the Department of Health. So the testing didn't begin today. We're on this final stage of getting some of these pieces in place, and that, I'm optimistic that could begin as early as tomorrow.
And this is a voluntary program for them, correct?
Yes, Councilor Borrego, I would say it is voluntary, although what our screening procedure is for the West Side, we are asking that all people that are coming into our emergency housing, we would screen, because we are in close proximity out there. And so we will handle that case by case if for some reason somebody did not want to, but that is our policy, that we would screen everybody.
And one last question. Is there any outreach for people that don't come to the facility?
Yes, Councilor Borrego. So in fact, we were having a call with our core homeless providers tomorrow morning. And so there are a lot of questions about that. We've got people continuing to do outreach. I can give you an example. There are people that may choose not to go out to the West Side, but we're reaching out, and there will be options. We've got to figure out that process as well.
Councilor Gibson, we're back to you.
Thank you. This question I have, this is my last question, and it's for our city attorney. And so, you know, going through some of the public comment that we have, and I've seen this before in the dozens of emails I looked at today, there are concerns that we are usurping constitutional rights by, you know, keeping the general public out of this meeting, and it feels weird just to have us here, right? So if you're watching, we miss you. Anyway, can you tell me? Can you tell us? You know how? And I believe that we are within the law, but can you talk about that a little bit for anybody who might be listening?
And Council President Davis, Councilor Gibson, I will do my best to give a brief overview, but feel free to ask any questions. Generally, the Open Meetings Act does not require public comment. I think that what the Open Meetings Act requires is reasonable notice. And in this situation, absolutely, I think that the council's actions here to close the building, to the public and close the meeting to the public is appropriate, and I don't have any concerns about the validity of this meeting or any action that may be that the council will act on here, and I think it's council's responsibility.
One follow-up real quick. So I get it. I understand about public comment. We've been through that a few years ago. But this is a little bit different, you know. And I understand we're doing it for health reasons, so it's very, yeah, it was like that. That's right.
That's me.
But this is different, even though it's for health reasons, and it's to protect everybody's from getting contaminated by a virus. So is there any protection that we have for that, or any anything that talks about that in our
Well,
ordinances or charter or anything?
Council President Davis, Councilor Gibson, I think that the council has a sufficient flexibility to be able to broadcast its meeting to the general public, particularly under circumstances like this, given the public health, the situation where we're at. So again, I don't have any concerns about this meeting being proper. It is, and any action that this council takes would be have the full force and effect of the law as well. So I'm not sure if I answered that question specifically, but the format is, I don't have any concerns, and I think it is a responsible and a reasonable step for this council to take.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we have Counselor Sena, and then we'll come back to the counselors who've come before. Counselor Sena? Just hit that, yeah.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask if the resources that are out there for children to pick up meals, or for the senior population to have meals, or the community centers that are staying open, are those resources being translated in multiple languages so that all of the communities have access?
Thank you, Council President Davis, Councilor Sena. That's a great question. I'm calling down Michelle Melendez, who's the Director of Equity and Inclusion for the city and has done a great job in ensuring that our resources are rolling out in languages that are accessible for the most of our community. So, Michelle?
Yes, Mr. President and Madam, or Councilor Sena. Yes, our office has been helping each department to develop its language access plans and to think proactively about what languages the information needs to go out in. A lot of this information is coming very, very quickly, so there is a little bit of a backlog in getting everything translated into the main languages that we're trying to get it into: Spanish, Simplified Chinese, Vietnamese at this time. Whenever possible, we're using pre-translated materials from the CDC or the New Mexico Department of Health. In the case of the school sites, we're using whatever APS can provide, and we've been in touch with the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs at APS, and anything that is not yet translated, we're putting it into the queue to become translated. One more question.
In regards to essential personnel that are continuing to keep our city safe and functioning, what support do they have in terms of staff?
Council President Davis, Councilor Sena, can I just ask a clarifying question? So support,
I just mean that if they need more staff, what are we doing to help the staffing?
thank you. Council President Davis, Councilor Sena. So what most of our directors that have a critical mass of essential personnel have done is instituted a rotation policy. So if, for example, you normally have 30 people doing an essential function, we're cutting that down to maybe 10, 10, and 10 so that everybody does get a chance to rest, go home. And then, of course, the option of paid leave is available to anyone who begins to experience symptoms or has been exposed to the virus.
And one more question, and how are we addressing the discrimination, harassment, and physical attacks that are occurring in the Pan-Asian community?
Mr. President and Councilor Sena, since the beginning, our Mayor Keller has included very strong statements really regarding public information releases and any public statements that we've made, telling people that if they experience any kind of harassment or discrimination, they should call our city's Office of Civil Rights. And we've also linked to that office on our city's website on the COVID-19 fact page, as well as telling people that if they experience any threats of violence, they should call APD, as always. And our mayor has recently written a letter to the Asian American community at large in care of the New Mexico Asian Family Services, expressing our administration's strong stance against xenophobia, stigmatizing people of Asian descent, discrimination, and spelling out what members of the community can do if they experience any of these things. And we've become aware of incidents in the city of Albuquerque. We're also asking the public to intervene wherever possible. One, by sharing only reliable information and not spreading this misinformation that is going out, and only sharing information from the New Mexico Department of Health and the CDC and trusted sources. And the other is to speak up if they hear, see, or witness any kind of misinformation or harassment. And again, asking them to call our Office of Civil Rights or APD if it is a threat of violence. And tomorrow we are meeting with the owner of a business who was targeted, and we're trying to follow up on a couple of incidents that we have been told were reported to police.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next up, we have Councilor Benton.
Mr. President, I was wondering if, I think when we started out, we were going to hear from different departments and maybe, so we don't have everybody having to, we could kind of maybe be focused by, I could start out here with Director Pierce again, since she's been up, but also had questions regarding planning. So however you want to conduct it, Mr. President, but I just sort of feel like we're kind of making people jump up and jump back and jump up again.
We're flexible.
But I will start with you, Ms. Pierce, and then however the President wants to handle the queue here is up to him. I did forward, and I want to thank Mrs. Stotts from our constituent of mine who pointed out the CDC's interim guidelines for homeless shelters, and I had not read it, so I was appreciative that she pointed it out to me, but I wanted to just be sure that you and your staff has read that, and from everything I see in the media, you seem to be following these guidelines.
Yes, Council President Davis and Councilor Benton. Yes, we're aware of all the guidance that is coming out, have reviewed that. We've had our medical director review that to put our policy in place as we move forward. And that includes there's certain distancing if we were needing to isolate someone. It includes our cleanliness out at our West Side Emergency Housing Center and many, many other things. So yes.
And at the West Side Shelter, is UNM and Healthcare for the Homeless still staffing that clinic at the same rate it has been, or?
Councilor President Davis and Councilor Benton, yes, tonight will be the Medical Reserve Corps and UNM. Wednesday night is First Nations, and Thursday night is Albuquerque Health Care for the Homeless. We have begun conversations. I mean, our community and our West Side Emergency Housing Center needs that service 7 days a week. That is what my wish was and my request was in the beginning. We've been working on it to do our best. We do know it makes a difference when that happens. 911 calls are reduced from the West Side. That's important. We want first responders to be doing their business. And so we continue to work hard with our partners to increase that coverage. So right now, we're only 3 of 7 nights a week.
And then would it make sense, or maybe you're already doing this as well, that these CDC interim guidelines be distributed to our community partners in the nonprofit sectors outside of Healthcare for the Homeless, who I'm sure is right on top of it?
President Davis and Councilor Benton, yes, that makes sense. And I will make sure, I know we've done a couple things. We had our first weekly call last Thursday we invited all of our providers, and the suggestion was made, which we followed. We took a standing hepatitis A call because, as I think everybody knows, I think our community did a great job keeping that. It wasn't an outbreak. So we ended up with about 450 people calling into that. And so we had Department of Health, Director Ryan Mast with us, and many people to talk about all the guidelines. Tomorrow's call will be a little bit smaller, but we will continue to do those weekly calls, but we'll make sure that those guidelines are out there.
Yeah, and I think, again, you've been in the media saying the right things. I mean, this is a very extremely vulnerable population. A lot of underlying conditions and reason to give special attention. One other quick question. The community support shuttle is still operating?
Yes, President Davis and Councilor Benton, we're talking about the VIC.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll have to say I didn't really check into any of that today, but as far as I know, yes, the community support shuttle is operating, and our other buses are operating as well, just more ongoing cleaning and that kind of thing.
Sure. I mean, I think those forms of transportation are also increasingly important under this situation. Thank you, Mr. President. I'll wait until we get another director up here.
Councilor Benton, thank you. We'll take a cue from that. Any other councilors for Director Pierce before we move on? Councilor Bassan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think it's you, Director. And I know I've asked this question of the administration earlier this week, via Ms. Yara, but I also realize that APS is, doing a really good job with the meals for children, and whether they're just 18 and younger. I just want to clarify, and I think for the sake of the public here at this meeting, if they haven't heard already, you know, what is the city's involvement in ensuring that children are going to be getting food, in addition to seniors at the senior centers? Even though I know that it's on the internet, some people might not know that they might be watching right now. So if you could please just cover that, I'd appreciate it.
Yep. President Davis and Councilor Bassan, yes. Well, a couple things. So APS, as we know, they've got their long list of where students and families are able to access food, and we've made sure that our community centers and our child development centers have those lists as well. We are providing food for those coming for services at our child development centers. And then what we've done at our community centers, as I think CEO Nair mentioned earlier, we are open for the next 3 weeks, 7:30 to 5:30, providing youth programming. We had moved our hot meal to the noon time, and so that hot meal is being provided, as well as the city of Albuquerque works with APS to fund community schools. And our community schools are working very hard in, I want to say 30 some odd sites to work on the food distribution. We worked with many partners here at the city of Albuquerque to have the reusable bags to get those meals given to those parents. So we're all pretty connected, but even on this child development call I mentioned, we made sure our own staff had the list for APS, as well as our health and social service centers. So those remain open. That's where people do know to go get emergency boxes. That staff has asked for more food, and we've increased the amount of food, and so we made sure all of our team knows that those are an available resource as well.
And Council President Davis and Councilor Bassan, one more thing. We did make the buses free for youth so that they can travel to get those meals if they don't have a parent at home who can get them there, or they can get to other resources as they need them.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And then Ms. Nair, maybe while I have your attention for the senior end of that, again, I think that I know I've heard and had my answer, which is fabulous. So if you can kind of expand on that, and just to also add on and mention, I think Director Pierce and it's just a comment, you're fine. But just that it's any child 18 and under that can go to any of these locations. It doesn't have to be an attendee of APS schools that go there in order to get the food. So I think that it's very important because there's so many people that rely on this, as for some of them, their only meal a day. But again, the senior centers, please and thank you.
Council President Davis, Councilor Bassan, Anna Sanchez, our Director of Senior Affairs, is here to give you those specific answers. And yes, that is a great point. The APS meals are free to every child. So that's a great move on their part.
Mr. President and Councilor Bassan, making sure you can hear me. Our focus really is on making sure that our seniors have the meals, right? They depend on the lunch meal primarily, and we're focusing very much on the nutrition food aspect of our services right now. So we are transitioning to kind of a model to make sure that individuals have the opportunity to do the pick up and go for those that frequent our centers, really as a way to be able to continue to promote that social distancing, ensuring that folks get the proper information, see a trusted face, and have that opportunity to come to our facilities and pick up and go, take that meal with them. Just another effort to be able to keep people distant and apart from each other, so we are committed to doing that.
Thank you. And then also, it might not be you, but I think it is, with delivery for those that don't have the availability to pick up and go?
Thank you. I appreciate you asking about our home delivery program because it's one of the strongest things that we do. We have an incredibly dedicated staff. So our home delivery program still operates as usual. We are receiving some calls from individuals that are calling our senior information assistant line at 764-6400. So we really want to push that because that is a gateway to all of our services. Our home delivery program is up and running, and we are committed to doing that and making sure that we have the personnel that is able to expand that if need be.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much. And Council President, my next thing will be for public safety when you're ready.
We'll come back. I think before Director Sanchez, I think Councilor Benton has a quick senior affairs question.
Madam Director, I'm going to stick with my transit and mobility questions for people who really need help with their mobility. We still have our,
thank you,
admittedly, sometimes complaints that we don't have enough, but I know that they try really hard to help people get to the centers when they need to get to them. Is that still operating normally?
So we have seen a decrease. Oh, sorry, Mr. President and Councilor Benton. We have seen a decrease in demand for calls from some individuals that we typically do see. We are doing also a lot of outreach and wellness checks with individuals, and our experienced case managers are checking in on folks. We continue to operate our service for folks that perhaps need a ride to a medical appointment. Those are priority for us.
All right, thank you.
Keeping with that theme of senior affairs, Councilor Sena.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had a question again about accessibility. Are these resources that you're sharing also in multiple languages, and especially for those that are hard of hearing?
Mr. President and Councilor Sena, yes, we are very much working in tandem with the Office of Equity and Inclusion to make sure that our information is posted in multiple languages. It's been really helpful to have those stop signs right at the front of the doors for all of our facilities. That's been a very, just kind of an opportunity for folks to evaluate whether or not they're feeling well and should be able to enter into that facility. We are seeing that folks are taking those precautions, and we're making sure we provide that information.
Thank you, ma'am. Senior affairs going once, going twice. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I think. Councilors, moving on to other topics. I know Councilor Bassan, you have a public safety question. Do you want to get us started with a different department?
I sure will. Thank you, Mr. President. So I have a question regarding public safety, and I know that I did, again, ask this in advance, hoping to not totally surprise you. So hopefully we won't see this problem at all, but with the fear that is escalating, and I think that we need to really start refocusing, and I think we're trying, but really prioritizing redirection of thought so that we don't cause more fear. But with depleting shelves in stores and with people fighting for supplies and everyday needs that they have, my concern is what is APD planning on, and how is the adjustment going to happen if crime escalates, as far as something like maybe looting, if we shut down more businesses and if we shut down different locations and people aren't even allowed to be in there. What do we do then, and what are you doing to prepare for that so that we can comfort, hopefully, the public instead of cause more to worry about?
Sure. Council President Davis, Councilor Bassan, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to start out with APD is training constantly for any various unexpected event, to include civil unrest. So we have contingency plans in place for events such as the events that you're describing. As far as the potential increase in crime due to the COVID-19 virus, we have an apparatus in place as well to track any kind of crime trends and reallocate resources as needed to accommodate for the different types of crimes that are going to spur, could potentially spur as a result of the displacement of this virus. So in addition, we have additional protocols in place to assign officers due to rioting, looting, or civil unrest as they arise. We're also working with big box stores when they receive shipments in place from their deliveries to ensure that they have an internal apparatus that kind of slows the stem of just a mass of people trying to get, say, toilet paper, which most of the stores are kind of running low on. So when a big box store will receive a shipment of toilet paper, the stores are either creating a voucher system, or they are, excuse me, they are limiting the number of people that they actually allow into the store, so there's not just a massive pile of people on a certain article.
Thank you very much. I think that it's important that we touch on that, just so that the public knows that, of course, we hope and believe that you're thinking about it. So it's nice to have that confirmation that you're planning for us to help keep us safe. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Councilors, other APD questions? Councilor Brego?
Thank you for being here, and I so want to thank police and fire for the work that you guys are doing out there. My question is, and I'd like you, for the public's sake, really to talk about the memorandums of understanding that you have with other jurisdictions, with the sheriff's office, state police, and other surrounding communities like Rio Rancho and Los Lunas, or other places like that, just so we understand the connections that we have in place.
Sure, Council President Davis, Councilor Borrego, thank you for the question. So currently in place, we have multiple MOUs throughout multiple different departments. So auto theft, for example, we have a working agreement between the state police and our auto theft team. We have what's called the multi-agency task force, which is a band of state police, the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, the Rio Rancho Police Department, and APD that investigate officer-involved shootings. So we already have a pretty good working relationship with most law enforcement agencies that are neighboring APD. We are, Chief Geyer actually has a meeting tomorrow with all the major chiefs of police in the state of New Mexico to begin to kind of coordinate a statewide effort for the COVID-19 response to ensure that we are following best practices as a state and to set up working relationships as need be to ensure that the public is safe, as safe as we can make them.
Just to follow up, so for example, and I'm just going to give an example, if I live in my district and something happens in the county, the police can respond to that issue if there is an issue. Or if over the boundary of Rio Rancho, for example, there is coordination and a network that is available.
Council President Davis, Councilor Borrego, yes, ma'am. So currently right now in the county, every APD officer is currently cross-commissioned to have jurisdiction in the county of Bernalillo. So even though it's not within the city limits, an officer for APD can make an arrest in the county of Bernalillo. I believe one of the things that we may be talking about tomorrow with all of the chiefs is the possibility of cross-commissioning to places like Sandoval or Valencia County as needs arise for APD to assist those other jurisdictions.
Just one last thing. With regard to what I heard on the news today about, letting out offenders from the jail that are probably lower on the totem pole, I guess, of crime. Could you just address that as well, please?
Sure, Council President Davis, Councilor Borrego. I'm not familiar with the article that you're alluding to. What I can tell you is that we have an apparatus in place, again, a structure in place with the Metropolitan Detention Center for prisoners that APD arrests, and they are screened both through medical, through APD, and then they're also screened at the Metropolitan Detention Center for the COVID-19 virus. But, excuse me, as far as the specific news article, I'm not familiar with it.
Councilors, other departments, other questions? Thanks. Councilor Benton, I just want to acknowledge, and part of our, hey, we know this this new temporary system works. I got a message from Bobby, who's the director at the VIC, who reached out and said, I saw the questions on the community shuttle, and we're operating 100%, implemented additional safety measures, and educating our riders for more than 10 days. And they're going to reach out with you tomorrow and give you a full update. Good. So we know folks are paying attention and weighing in.
Council President Davis, if I might, I neglected to mention one person who's been really critical to this entire effort, which is Roger Ebner, our Director of the Office of Emergency Management. He's here, I believe. He is the one who sends about 1,000 emails telling us to do our continuity plans and keep all our numbers updated, and then everybody ignores it, and then he sends it again, and he's been really effective at his job. So I was on a call with other large city executives, and so many of them are scrambling to do their continuity plans right now, and we are not because of our Office of Emergency Management. So just wanted to give him a shout out for that work.
Thank you, Ms. Nair. And I want to agree. It is like watching some of these other cities try to catch up. It has been really nice in the last few weeks to be in the meetings where we're putting those programs in place and not trying to design them on the fly. It sure gives us a lot more time and room for our staff on the ground to work on those little issues and personal issues and help us work with individuals and not big systems. So, and I want to acknowledge and say thank you to Roger as well on our behalf. Last week we were able to take some counselors out to the EOC, show them how that process works, let them ask questions and see for themselves how that's happening. So for counselors that didn't get a chance to do that last week, I know Roger's already extended that invitation. We're always welcome to come visit and see how the city is operating behind the scenes and how we do that. And I hope you'll take a chance to do it. I think some of the counselors that got to go visit, Counselor Sena, Counselor Jones, Counselor Bassan, I think that was really informative to see how that's working firsthand. Counselor Benton, really quickly.
I had a couple more questions, if it's all right, Mr. President. One is with regard to ABQ ride and transit. Are we, I know in some places where the outbreaks are severe, public transit is being suspended. I know the governor weighed in and we suspended the Rail Runner Express service. Is there any anticipated reductions in regular transit or Sunvan type transit?
Mr. President and Councilor Benton, you are correct. The governor did suspend service on the Rail Runner beginning today. All our routes are operating, and we don't anticipate suspending any of the routes. We are, however, evaluating some of the routes that connect to the Rail Runner, some of the regional routes that are designed specifically to connect to those stations, to ensure that if the ridership is not there, that we may deploy those bus drivers into other routes where we know that we might not have enough drivers, or where it would make more sense to augment the service that we already are providing. And as Ms. Nair said earlier, we are offering free service for anyone 18 years and younger on the system, as well as our paratransit system is running as normal. We have seen a dramatic decrease in the use of the paratransit system, just because I think a lot of folks are heeding to the concerns of basically staying home and not getting around as much as they would have normally. But at this point, all the services are there. I would also just indicate to all of you that we are working with a private company that's locally owned here in Albuquerque that actually develops products to sterilize different types of equipment. They are setting up a system up at the transit facility so that we can actually wash the buses. They are doing this free of service as their way to contribute to the continuing cleanliness of the transit system because of the amount of use that it does get. So we are very fortunate to have that partnership. But again, it's our interest is to continue to have the service because we know a lot of folks that really need that service to get to meals, as we've been talking about, or to other services in the community.
And Mr. President, thank you, Mr. Earl. And just drew a blank. Oh, I did see that maybe this is the same group, but there was something in the paper about 15 temporary people working to maintain cleanliness on the buses.
Mr. President and Councilor Benton, this was a different group, but they're all partnering together, and that's what we've seen, councilors really coming into the mayor's office, and I'm sure you've seen it coming into your offices. Many Albuquerqueans, Burqueños wanting to help in ways that they can to support the city, and these folks you talk about are some of those folks. This is a different company, but again, it's all part of folks coming together, the one Albuquerque umbrella to help each other, which is what community is about.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. Rowley, yeah, this is really a time for us to remember one Albuquerque. It really is particularly apropos slogan right now. And yeah, the reason I keep asking about transportation, whether it's our public transit system or our community support shuttle or the senior access, is it really, we need to be insured, and I think my sense is the administration, the Office of Equity and Inclusion and Civil Rights are on the ball that these kind of situations can raise issues of equity, and some people have no choice but to use transit and to use paratransit, et cetera. So very important to me. I honestly was somewhat disappointed about the Rail Runner Express, but I know the state is our partner in that, so that's the end of that discussion. But that was the reason I was asking about it. And thank you, Mr. President. Unless I do have questions on planning and also on the water board.
Quickly, I think Councilor Borrego has a question on transit. We'll come back to those two, and then I'm sorry.
Actually, I have a question for emergency operations.
Okay. Let's put that after Councilor Benton's other question. We'll put that after Councilor Benton's other questions. Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think I can get through these fairly quickly. Just following up on the planning discussion, planning department, is the DRB and the EPC meeting as regularly scheduled?
Mr. President and Councilor Benton, we've advised all of our boards and commissions that due to the issue of social separation, if you will, that unless they are absolutely involved in any kind of a decision that's critical, that they suspend a lot of their meetings for at least the 30-day period that we're talking about. The DRB and the EPC are both reviewing their schedules and what they have on their dockets. If we find that they are absolutely necessary to have a meeting, we will work with them to get that done. But you know, from the perspective of many of our other boards, we're simply advising that at least for a 30-day period, if they can delay having to meet, that they are doing so. But we don't want to impact any development that's occurring, because we know that this issue of the COVID-19 is going to affect our economy, and some of the important steps and work that DRB does in particular to get our construction industry continue to working is important. So we'll evaluate those as we go through the process.
Thank you, Mr. President, and just thought, you know, I was reminded of that with Councilor Gibson's question, and actually had shared the same emails had been shared with me as well. And yeah, with some of these projects, you know, really time is money, and construction in general is probably something that can continue during the virus. Typically, people are pretty far distant apart doing their different jobs on out in the field, and we do need to keep that economic ball rolling. The one other one has to do with the, maybe, I'm not sure who here should address, perhaps members who are sitting on the Water Authority Board. Are they continuing to meet?
I'll defer to Councilor Jones, but go ahead.
Mr. President, Councilor Benton, at this point, the Water Authority has canceled their next scheduled meeting, and we'll wait to see what they're planning in the future.
But I will point out, Councilor Jones, if I can, and Councilor Benton, I do want to point out that the Water Authority, just before we convened today, did announce that they have they've halted the disconnection for anyone who's unable to pay their bill, along with PNM as well today. And so I think we're seeing our public utilities are stepping up to do their part to not add another burden to folks who may be in a financial situation. And I do want to appreciate the Water Authority for doing that, and PNM as well.
Thank you. You read my mind. I think that's was my immediate concern. All right. Thank you.
I think we're back to Councilor Borrego for one more question.
I'd like to ask Roger to come up. I think it's important that we talk a little bit about the Office of Emergency Management, which he is the director of. And I know that when I was staff, I was deployed, and I saw the operation. And I mean, we had the Taos electrical outage, and I think, Roger, you had just been hired. And I was just so impressed with the way it operates, but I think it's important that the public understands that this operation is available and what it does.
Council President Davis, also members of the council. Yeah, I think that the emergency management services are a critical asset to the city, and we have a comprehensive program and a comprehensive plan that deals with all hazards. We don't focus on the causation of an incident, but rather the consequences. So by doing that, we're able to focus on meeting the needs that are presented each day to us. We have an emergency operations center. We have a joint information center as facilities where we can guide and direct all of the city activities that are needed for any type of threat or hazard. And so with the right planning, with the right facilities, and all the right people that we have, you know, with the city agencies and other departments, I think we have a very good program to help the city in all times.
Your center also coordinates with police, fire, and the state of New Mexico, and they have an emergency operations center as well. Is that correct?
Council President Davis, also members of the council, yes, that's true. At this time, and as is usual, all of the different EOCs that are activated, not just with the state, with the county and so on, but all of the city healthcare entities that have operation centers, so all the hospitals. So we're linked up, and we are talking about various needs and requests. For example, at this time, over the last week, we have received lots of requests from the healthcare industry and others for various protective masks. And so we have distributed more than 30,000 of them over the last 7 days.
Thank you, Roger. I just wanted the public to understand what your operation does and how, you affect the public and any kind of a crisis situation, if hopefully that won't be the case, other than the public health issue. But I know Councilor Bassan asked about, if there was an increase in crime. We know that you all are there and you're coordinating for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Councilor Pena, did you have something?
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Just a short kind of comment. APS is doing that thing on the meals for the students, and they're providing that information. I've been sharing it on Facebook, and it's been pretty helpful, helpful resources out in the community. So I was wondering if maybe the administration's considered or is putting together kind of some short PSAs on some of the services that we have available so that we can share on social media as well. Somebody mentioned about the free bus rides for students, and then obviously, my concern is kind of has been reiterated here is, our most vulnerable population and how to be able to make sure that they can access that information. I've been on the city website, and there's a lot of information about the coronavirus and the updates and the symptoms, but I think that would be an added benefit to our community.
Council President Davis, Councilor Pena, yes, we've been doing a lot on social media, on all the platforms, including infographics, and then I think really today we started rolling out the short 30-second videos on different features. So I think the first one that went out was about helping our local businesses during this difficult time and getting takeout when you can and all that good stuff. So you'll be seeing those come out for the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilors, other topics, other questions for the administration? Come one, come all. Great. Thanks so much. Let me just add my piece. I'll have a chance to talk a lot more later, I think, on these other legislation. But Ms. Nyer, I just want to say thank you. The administration's been great to work with on this, and it's been great for all of our directors. As we start looking ahead into the getting out of the what changed today conversation, which we've been great at, I think this conversation reminds me that we ought to start taking a look, and I know Councilor Benton has a budget legislation that we'll be introducing tonight on sort of what type of emergency needs we might need in terms of funding. I know when we had the influx of asylum seekers, for example, we needed to dip into the till a little bit to help our community providers step up to that response. I know we're hearing from some of our homeless providers that some extra stress of finding more costly options for takeout and for extra cleaning and whatever. It will long-term impact their ability to provide those services. I know we're working on it, but it would be great, I think, if we could find a way with the council administration to work together to look at some of those emergency funding needs and start prioritizing those, and we'd love to be a part of that.
Thank you, Council President Davis. We have both short-term Tiger teams that are meeting every day and looking at the 3-day window, sort of the what now, and then we have a 30-day planning team that's looking at some of that longer stuff, and then hopefully eventually 30 days becomes 60 days, and we'd be happy to keep you in the loop as those projects start to come out.
Great. Thank you, ma'am. Councilors, last call. We're going to put administration Q&A for other topics in here too, because I know we have some directors who still have to go upstairs and do some more work to get ready for whatever happened today for tomorrow. So, councilors, other questions for the administration? Seeing none, thank you, ma'am. We'll defer to you to see who gets to go home and who has to stay, but thank you all for bringing everybody and helping to update the public as well. Tonight, we don't have any economic development discussions. We have covered administration Q&A. And so I'm going to move to the item of the journal. Councilor Gibson.
I'll move approval for the March 2nd journal.
Second. We have a motion and a second. Any objection? All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
That item carries. Next up, we have communications and introductions. We have a few changes to the letter of introduction this evening, mainly because we're making some accommodations for suspending our committees over the next couple of weeks. I'll move first that the rules be suspended for the purpose of placing EC 55 on tonight's agenda for final action. EC 55 is the appointment of Ethan Watson to the position of city clerk. I have a motion and a second. We need 2/3 of councilors present to vote yes. All those in favor say yes. Yes. That item carries unanimously. Next up, I move that the rules be suspended for the purpose of placing 04 on tonight's agenda for final action. 04 is legislation updating the civil emergency powers sections of the revised ordinances of Albuquerque and Office of Emergency Preparedness, section 2921 through 2922. I have a motion and a second. I'm sorry, Ms. Ortega, I want to ask, do we need that emergency language in here as well, or is that covered elsewhere?
Mr. President, it's covered elsewhere in
Thank
your
you.
script when we actually move and get to the bill.
Nope, just want to be sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. All those in favor say yes. Yes. Any opposed? That item carries unanimously. Next, I move that the rules be suspended for the purpose of pulling R17 out of the Finance and Government Operations Committee and placing it on tonight's agenda for action. R17 approves and authorizes the acceptance of FY 2020-2018 GO bonds from the state of New Mexico for public libraries and providing for that appropriation. Do I have a second? I have a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes. That item carries unanimously. Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules be suspended for the purpose of introducing 07 and placing it on the April 6th council agenda for action. 07 is enacting an ordinance to provide special procedures for the City of Albuquerque fiscal year 2021 budget, superseding certain provisions of the present city budget ordinance. And councilors, we did distribute the bill, and apologies, of course, for kind of some fast-moving conditions here, but we do want to be able to analyze our revenues and our expenditures in a somewhat more expedited way, and also with a consideration for a moving target. So that's what this is really about. We would have a full debate and discussion and vote on this hopefully at our next meeting.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say yes. Yes. That item carries unanimously. I move that the rules be suspended for the purpose of pulling EC 48 out of the Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee and placing it on tonight's agenda for action. EC 48 is the mayor's appointment of Timothy McEachern to the Environmental Planning Commission. I have a motion and a second from Councilor Jones. All those in favor say yes. That item carries unanimously. Next, I move to pull EC 35 out of the Finance and Government Operations Committee and place it on the April 6th council agenda for action. EC 35 is the approval of the Center for Transportation and Environment Professional Technical Contract. I have a motion and a second from Councilor Benton. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say yes. Next, we move to pull R19 out of the Finance and Government Operations Committee and place it on the April 6th council agenda for action. R19 amends the capital improvement program of the city by supplementing current appropriations for contributions received from Bernalillo County. Motion and a second. All those in favor say yes. That item carries. Next, we move to pull 03 out of the Finance and Government Operations Committee and place it on the April 6th council agenda for action. 03 amends section 92316, the permit fee section of the HART ordinance, and adds language regarding microchipping, spaying, and neutering fees, removing language pertaining to the HART ordinance fund, and amending a single definition. Do I have a second? A motion and a second. All those in favor say yes. That item carries unanimously. Councilors, are there other items or changes to the letter of introduction? So before we move for approval, I just want to clarify for folks watching at home, what we're doing tonight is that normally these bills are assigned to a committee that would be heard and then come back to the city council meeting on April 6th anyway. But we're taking some extraordinary steps to limit the need for those in-person meetings. And so we're just going to make our April 6th meeting a little longer and have those debates here instead of in committee. And that's what councilors are doing tonight with their legislation.
Mr. President, I move approval of the letter of introduction.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
Great. Tonight we have no reports from committees. Councilors' deferrals and withdrawals. Councilor Harris on 072.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the matter of 072, amending Section 1420, the dilapidated commercial building and properties ordinance to implement permanent procedures following the conclusion of a 24-month pilot project. I move deferral until April 20th.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
And that item carries. Councilor Pena, 178.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that R-178, amending the adopted capital implementation program of the City of Albuquerque by supplementing current appropriations for the Arenal Crestview Bluff space land acquisition. I move deferral until April 20th.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
Councilor Pena, will you take that next one as well?
Thank you. This is myself and Councilor Benton. I move that Committee Sub R-179, amending the composition of the Board of Housing Commissioners for the Albuquerque Housing Authority, deferral until April 20th.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
All right, councilors, any other deferrals or withdrawals this evening? Seeing none, we'll move on to our consent agenda. For individuals on tonight's consent agenda who are watching and agreed to be appointed to a board and commission, we appreciate your service very much, and thank you for your willingness to serve. At some point, we'll have an opportunity to thank you in person when we're back to normal business. Councilors, are there any other changes to the consent agenda?
Mr. President, I move approval of the consent agenda.
We have a motion in several seconds. All those in favor say yes. And the consent agenda is approved. Generally, at this point, we would go to general public comment, but as was stated earlier, in-person comments were available to be submitted online and by phone earlier, and so councilors have those available, and I'm sure we'll reference them in our discussions this evening. And so moving on, we're going to move to announcements. If the committee chairs are okay, I'll just make the omnibus announcements regarding our committees here. The following committee meeting dates have been canceled. The March 23rd Finance and Government Operations Committee, the March 24th Public Safety Committee, the March 25th Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee, and the March 26th ABC County Government Commission meeting that Councilor Pena chairs. So, councilors, are there any other announcements? Councilor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is not an announcement, but actually maybe a request. I really appreciate these, that staff has collected them and printed them out for us. But it seems like an awful lot of paper, and I was wondering if we could, if we do have to do this again next time, if we could just put them in the bill book. Would that be more work for you? Hopefully less work.
Yes,
for
Mr.
staff.
President, Councilor Gibson, unfortunately, we weren't as prepared today to handle that electronically, and we were taking comments up to about 4:30 today, and so, actually 4:45, so we will get a better process that doesn't kill as many trees going forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. President, could I suggest maybe we download them onto a flash drive?
Great. Hopefully, we won't make this a normal process for too long. So, Councilor Pena reminded me that the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Water Authority meeting for next week is also canceled, as we might have alluded to earlier. Councilors, other announcements? Seeing none, we have no public hearing scheduled for this evening. We're going to move on to items for approval. The first up would be EC 55, the appointment of Mr. Ethan Watson to the position of City Clerk. I would move confirmation. And we have a second from Councilor Gibson. Mr. Watson has been patient to sit here with us, and I think most of us know him from his work for a number of years. But Mr. Watson, we want to invite you down, say hello, introduce yourself, and then put you out for questions from councilors.
Council President, members of the council, I want to thank you for having me here this evening and thank the mayor and his administration for nominating me for this role. I've served as the Deputy City Clerk for the last year, and it's an honor to be nominated to lead the clerk's office and continue the work we're doing there. A lot of the work we do is not Super Bowl exciting, but it's definitely good government exciting. And I think we have a lot of exciting projects going on in that office. We've created a consolidated team to handle IPRA requests. They're generating data about what the public wants. We're using that data to drive the scanning of the city's record center. We recently pulled 110 boxes out of the fire marshal's offices, scanned them all, put them online, and Deputy Chief Gene Gallegos now has more room in his office to do what he needs to do. So it's exciting stuff. I think we're also trying to make public financing more accessible to candidates and the public, and As of this week, we've revamped telephonic hearings in the Office of Administrative Hearings because of the coronavirus issues, and so there's a lot of great stuff going on, and I'd look forward to continuing to serve as the city clerk, and I'd be open to any questions the city council has.
Thank you, sir. Councilors, questions, comments? That's usually a good sign. Anything from the administration?
Thank you, Council President Davis. I'll just echo that there aren't a lot of people who attack this type of work with the enthusiasm and really joy that Acting City Clerk Ethan Watson has brought. When we interviewed him for the position, he said, "I've got big plans for the office," and he really does. I mean, this is where his passion is, so we're lucky to have him. Thank you for your consideration.
Thanks. Councilors, seeing no other discussion, all those in favor say yes. Yes. Any opposed? Congratulations, you're unanimously confirmed. Councilors, the only other item we have on final action this evening is 04. 04 updates the Civil Emergency Power Section 2911 through 2917 of the revised ordinances of Albuquerque and Office of Emergency Preparedness. I would move a due pass. I have a motion and a second for Councilor Benton. Before we move to, I'll go ahead and ask the staff to go ahead and distribute the floor sub, which I believe we already have. Is that right? Councilors, earlier today, you might have seen different versions of a floor sub floating, but the one we distributed to the public is the one staff distributed to us here on the dais this evening, and so we're going to be referring and working from that one. To get started, let me explain really briefly where we are. I see Mr. Melendrez is here, who's been our technical expert on this, and I know we also have our Emergency Management Director, Mr. Ebner, here as well. Some of you know, I came to this work to this moment sort of in my background in public safety and emergency management. As a police officer in D.C., I didn't just work in the field. I ended my service there working in the chief's office where I worked in our Joint Operations Center post 9/11. I've always taken an interest in public safety and emergency management, and we wanted to be sure that our city is prepared as well. We know that good preparedness starts long before the crisis hits, and so almost a month ago, working with the administration and city legal, Mr. Melendrez and I began a review of our city laws governing emergencies and the powers that we might need. It was clear that we needed an update. The provisions that are on the books were written in 1968 at the height of the Vietnam War protest, mainly for riot control in the event of earthquakes and mass looting, things that we hope we never get to under this current epidemic, but certainly didn't have all the tools we needed in order to implement some of the common sense social distancing and common sense public health laws that we needed. We also had a chance to review other city laws, particularly ones around the budget that particularly limit the mayor's ability to reallocate staff and resources above about $100,000 plus or minus in most line items. And given today's city budget, in the event of an emergency, we could potentially go through more than that in a single day in overtime or other expenses. And clearly, we needed to provide the city and the administration with some guidance and our public with some assurance on how we would respond for an outbreak. These proposed powers allow the mayor to implement some very basic social distancing provisions, like limiting the sale of critical medical items, for example, to personal use, not hoarding limits, and the ability to redeploy staff between departments. Say we needed to use the folks at the airport to help clean a community center and disinfect it so that we could provide more community meals, as we heard earlier today. But the original legislation added contagious outbreaks to the list of civil emergencies that were already on the books. But appropriately so, I think some folks worried that some of the anti-riot provisions might be inappropriate for the use in a public health, and they're right. And so we've introduced a substitute that just creates a whole new section of public health law, with limited authority, scaled back to address the most urgent epidemic prevention needs. Nothing in this new legislation allows the mayor, or anyone else for that matter, to force a quarantine, to take away any private property, or to seize anyone's guns, or even limit the sale of those. In looking at the new public health powers, we discovered that our ancient 50-year-old civil emergency powers, adopted in 1968, have not been updated since. Although they haven't been challenged, I think there's some concern that even some of those old provisions have probably been superseded by state laws and constitutional changes since the 60s. And if we want to revisit those, I hope other counselors will take the opportunity to do so by asking for a legal opinion or introducing amendments to address those provisions. But that's not our focus today, and it's not the issue that's before us that needs our immediate attention. So to ensure that nobody's confused, I proposed an amendment that makes it absolutely clear that public health emergencies are different than the ones already on the books, and so are the tools we'll have to respond. Finally, I want to point out, and I know we'll get a chance to talk about this, that this legislation not only requires the mayor to publish every action that he takes under these provisions, but it also gives the city council the ability to amend or cancel any order of the mayor by a simple majority vote. And under our rules, any 3 councilors can call a special meeting for that purpose, or the council president can do so in an emergency to act within hours if absolutely necessary. They're some of the most robust check and balance structures in city law, and ones that I think as city councilors we would all insist upon and should. Tonight, I'm sure we're going to have a good debate. I know there are some amendments, and I welcome those. But to begin with, I believe we have a good floor substitute, and so I'd like to move the floor substitute for 04 to get our conversation started. I have a second from Councilor Benton. All those in favor of the floor sub for 04 say yes. Yes. All those opposed? That item carries unanimously. We're back on the floor sub. Councilors, we will open the floor for debate. Councilor Bassan, you want to kick us off?
Thank you, Mr. President. I do have a statement that I would like to read before we get started with the amendments. So I find the unprecedented events, it's weird talking to an almost empty room, sorry. I find the unprecedented events of last week to be extremely disturbing. Albuquerque has, in a very short period of time, descended into a state of widespread panic. Each year, influenza kills up to 60,000 people in this country alone and has for centuries. Yet the flu has never before caused our economy to be destroyed, our schools to be shuttered, and store shelves to be emptied. Albuquerque's citizens are scared. They're searching for anything they can hold on to reclaim a sense of control. This anxiety has led to the stockpiling of everyday items like toilet paper, bottled water, and hand sanitizer. Our city government must act now to fight the real enemy, fear. City Council has an obligation to calm our residents, to encourage them to continue with their everyday lives. Cold and flu epidemics occur every winter. This is a new form of virus we face and should respect. It is a fact that the vast majority of us will suffer only mild symptoms before making a full recovery. Yes, there are those of us who are more susceptible to the effects of any infectious disease, particularly the elderly and people with existing health conditions. Those folks deserve extra precautions, such as social distancing, to prevent them from being infected. The best way to flatten the curve is to remain cautious and to implement common sense practices that we should already be doing: frequent hand washing, covering a cough, regularly cleaning surfaces, and staying home when sick. As a result of the COVID-19 hysteria, we are considering surrendering our freedoms our forefathers enshrined in the Constitution and our veterans have sacrificed so much to protect. Today's proposed legislation would give any mayor of Albuquerque the power to choose whether residents are allowed, which residents are allowed to meet, which schools are permitted to teach, and which businesses are allowed to operate. This update to the existing Civil Emergency Powers Ordinance would also grant any Albuquerque mayor the authority to redistribute money to whatever emergency expenditure he or she chooses. Just as troubling, this bill will also grant any Albuquerque mayor powers to use privately owned property without following any of the usual requirements. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Those who would give up liberty to purchase safety deserve neither." Those words were as true then as they are today. Yes, infectious diseases cause harm, and yes, we absolutely must take precautions. But at this moment in time, residents in Albuquerque are being bombarded with the euphemism abundance of caution, which is quickly becoming a metaphor for loss of freedom. We will survive the 2020 cold and flu season. I pray that our civil liberties will survive as well. Therefore, I urge each city councilor to vote against tonight's proposed legislation, or at least approve the several proposed amendments that shall follow.
Councilor Bassan, to get us started, do you want to move your amendments?
I would love to move my amendments, but if you will bear with me, we had some miscommunication between those two drafts earlier, so stick with me here, please. I move floor amendment A for floor sub 024. On page 4, lines 2 through 3, strike the added language throughout the duration of the emergency, including any provisions above that have not been previously invoked. This amendment removes the added language as stated, as it seems arbitrary and ambiguous and is not conducive to the enactment of the law. So I think that we're kind of muddying the waters by adding that in there, and just to kind of clear it up and tighten the language, I think that it would be appropriate to strike that language.
Thanks. So we have a motion and a second on what we'll call floor amendment number 1. I'm going to take a quick privilege, actually. I skipped over. I want to be sure the administration has an opportunity to weigh in on the floor sub or the general bill before we get to amendments tonight, if that's okay. If the administration wants to comment here or just as we go forward, however you'd like to go.
Sure, Council President Davis, we're happy to stand for questions. As you mentioned, this was really an initiative that came out of the council rather than something that we had requested, and I think it was a smart, proactive move. So we're happy to clarify any questions that folks have.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to be sure we didn't skip over that part. So we're back on floor amendment number 1 as seconded. Councilors, discussion on this item. Mr. Melendrez, could I ask, as a staff, as our expert here, I think you added that language as a recommendation. Can you tell us a little more about what you think there?
Yes, Mr. President, I think I can provide some context here. So as you mentioned, with respect to the original bill as compared to the floor substitute, the original bill sort of merged in the public health emergency together with the existing provisions for riot-type emergencies. And that language was added because the public health emergency was proposed to last a longer duration than the mere 48 hours. And so it was intended to be clear that in the event that such an emergency was declared for a set period of time, that any associated orders that were necessary to protect the public health would be in existence and last throughout that duration. With this floor sub, it appears to me to be a remnant within that section. It was not intended to relate to the riot provisions. It was intended to relate only to this new section. And so I'm not sure whether there was an oversight in the drafting of this bill, but it does appear to be an oversight with respect to trying to separate those out, those two provisions out.
So there wouldn't be the objection just to doing this. It wouldn't change the bill. It would just make it cleaner.
Mr. President, my understanding is that the intent is to leave the existing section completely alone. And so by making this amendment to the bill, it would clarify that's consistent with that intent.
Great. I'd support it. Any other questions? Councilor Bassan to close.
I urge your support on this one.
Councilors, all those in favor of floor amendment number 1 say yes. Yes. Any opposition? That item carries unanimously. Councilor Bassan on amendment B.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a motion for amendment B for the floor sub 02004. On page 4, strike lines 16 through 17, deleting added section B. This amendment removes the added public health emergency powers of the mayor related to placing limitations on the quantities and types of items private businesses may sell during such an emergency. Private businesses have the right to determine what products and quantities they're sold. I understand that we have a hoarding epidemic as well right now as this pandemic that our world is facing. However, I do think that this is, I would hope that private businesses will enact their own limitations on what and quantity of what they're going to be selling. And I really would hate to take away that right from the private business owner.
So we have a motion and a second on item B, which we'll call floor amendment number 2. Councilors, other discussion. I'm going to make an amendment to the amendment here. And here's why. I don't necessarily have an objection to sort of taking out the language around alcohol sales, alcohol restaurants and bars, privately owned businesses. I think those can be covered by the state. I think they have that authority already, and I do think in an emergency, I think the city gets that covered otherwise in other ways. I want to ask the administration, do you have any comments or thoughts on this?
Thank you, Council President Davis. We're just seeing this for the first time, but on first blush, just want to say that this was none of this store stuff was contemplated when we talked about what we needed to do for this particular issue. However, the state is drastically reducing capacity. Many states and cities have already moved to closing restaurants for takeout only. So if we were to have a violation of that state law, what are we going to do if we don't have the power to then order the closing of that particular establishment? So also with diminished public safety resources, we don't know, but if we reach that point in time, we know the nexus between crimes and bars and late night and guns that happen in the city and drive violent crime. So those were I imagine, the reasons that those provisions were added, and we supported those reasons.
If I may, Mr. President.
Councilor Bassan.
I think that on the floor sub that came out towards the end, right before our meeting began, what was formally as B, C, and D with in relation to alcohol sales, cessation of alcoholic beverages, restaurants, bars, and privately owned businesses, those have all not appeared on the floor substitute as presented here, if I'm correct?
Mr. President, Councilor Bassan, during the quick development of this bill, there were a couple of draft versions, and the floor sub that was distributed tonight does not include those provisions that are being discussed right now already. And so the amendment that you made does refer correctly to the floor sub that is distributed and before the council.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Melendrez. So just to reiterate, this motion is to make an amendment for Amendment B. On page 4, the only thing I'm asking to amend is striking lines 16 through 17, which will in turn delete section B, which is to limit the kinds and quantities of items that a business may sell per customer per day. Again, I think that although the intention is seemingly very clear that we should be able to limit, and people should limit what they do, I think that we can't put that requirement on a private business owner if they want to sell 6 cans of chicken noodle soup to somebody that might have a family of 8 people and they're still deciding to personally ration. And I think this could get very extreme with that and limiting in a way that the unintended consequences can present themselves.
So just to clarify, Councilor Bassan, the amendment that we need to think about here, and I realize the version that was provided to the public earlier and that's provided on the dais tonight is a little different than some of the draft versions that went around, but you're only limiting your amendment at this point to what is currently Section B, page 4, line 16 and 17, relating to the anti-hoarding provisions. Is that right?
That is correct. I think that, this could extend another, yes, you are correct, Mr. President. I think that it's also worthy to say that this can be anything, I can be talking cans of soup, but then we could be talking about ammunition or guns, which I think all of us have seen in many of the emails that we've gotten today. Retail and limiting the kinds and quantities of items that a business may sell per customer per day. I think even though the intention is to make sure that people don't buy too much toilet paper or people don't buy too many non-perishable food items, I think this could go bigger than what we really need to be focusing on here, and I think it puts us at risk.
Thank you. Councilor Gibson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. You talked a little bit, sorry, I'm talking with Councilor Bassan, but there was, some really clear points made, really good points, I think, made about the anxiety and the tension in the city, and certainly, I think, across the entire world, really. And I agree that whatever we can do to kind of lower that and encourage deep breaths, starting with me, that's a good thing to do. But what's happening is that we are seeing people buying massive quantities of X, Y, and Z, and that scares a lot of people. So just by not doing that, I think that's going to bring the anxiety level down quite a bit in the city. So that said, I like that language in there. Again, we have to remember that if this is ever abused by any mayor, the council, whoever's sitting up here, can call an emergency meeting, and I should form this more of a question. than a statement, but this is my understanding, that this body can call an emergency meeting and overrule what the proclamation that the mayor has made. So, may I, Mr. Melendres, can you confirm that? Do I have that correctly stated? Do you want me to repeat it?
Mr. President and Councilor Gibson, yes, if you don't mind.
Okay, so if, my point is if this passes and some mayor down the road in a few years abuses it and declares a proclamation and shuts down a theater or says that people can't buy more than X number of rolls of toilet paper, for example, this council can call an emergency meeting and overrule that.
Mr. President, Councilor Gibson, that's exactly correct. The bill does draft in the city council being a check on that authority. The bill does grant the mayor the authority to make the initial decision. However, the city council at its earliest ability would be able to step in and make any changes or cancellations as deemed appropriate.
Okay, so we have a pretty good check there that I think is really an important part of this. I am trying to say that when people go to the store, and I've heard it several times this weekend already, this past weekend, that the certain stores' shelves were empty, okay? That's not due to the supply chain. That is due to hoarding. People are, kind of going overboard a little bit and buying everything they can see on the shelf, whatever item. So that's a product of hoarding, not supply. So I'm sorry, but I am going to be voting against this particular amendment because of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Gibson. Councilor Jones.
I do support this. I think we're a free country, and the stores have the right to stock the merchandise and to sell as they want. And the way this is written, limit the kinds and quantities of items. I mean, that means we could go in and tell the stores that they have to carry all canned chicken soup. It's pretty broad. And I think this is just a way to give the merchants, who are the ones at risk here, not us, the right to stock what they want and sell what they want and how they want. It's a freedom that we have in this country that I think it's being a little overreaching if we were to remove that.
Councilor Borrego.
I am going to support this because, yesterday I went to Smith's and they didn't have any water. And I went to Sprouts and they had plenty of water. I think that by limiting, and when I did go to Sprouts, and I will say this, and I'm not advertising for anyone, they had a sign that said a limit of 2 cases per customer. And I thought, it was a responsible business because they decided what their limitations were. And as a business owner myself, if I wanted to sell 10 pair of earrings or 1 pair of earrings, I think that's part of who we are as a country. And I think it's important that we not, direct unless, we're dealing with a public health issue, yes. But, I don't think we're going to run out of toilet paper. I really don't. I think that people are going to manufacture it. It's not manufactured in China. It's manufactured in South America. There's going to be a supply. Just yesterday I was traveling on I-40 East, and there were tons of semis with I'm sure they had supplies. And I'm thinking to myself, we need to really work as a body to reduce fear and anxiety for people. And it's not the first time we've dealt with a public health issue in our country. We will get through it. We're not dealing with the apocalypse. I don't think we're all going to die tomorrow. So I think private business, that's there. And we're also having negative sort of impact on economics if we start saying, well, you can only sell this or you can only sell that. I mean, that's what our country was built on.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Sena.
Mr. President, thank you. I had just had a question in terms of if there is not a limitation for people with working families or people on assistance or people who are forced to have to work, and at the end of the day, whenever their shift ends, whether it's 10 p.m. or 8 p.m., by the time they get to these stores, my concern is whether or not they have those resources to even purchase them. And even if it's whichever store that they're going to, elderly neighbor told me that he went to the local Walmart and he didn't have a lot of the resources that were there, so he just got whatever he could, which was, you know, a few bags of lima beans, and he doesn't really eat that, but that's for emergent cases, and so he is concerned about being able to purchase these things. So I have that question, Mr. President.
Thank you, Counselor. To answer your question and to respond to another I heard, I appreciate that very much, and that's the intent of this piece of legislation. Again, we have to remember these are extraordinary powers for extraordinary times, and also, as Counselor Gibson reminded us, some of the strongest checks and balances in city law are included in this new proposed ordinance precisely for that reason. If we think someone's gone above and beyond or outside the bounds, we have a provision to pull that back pretty quickly if we needed to. But I think our current experience shows us that what might be rational and might make sense according to the experts is not always what the public may do. And Counselor, to answer your question, I agree. That's the reason this is here, because not everybody has the equal means to prepare themselves and to be available. But I think I still yet to see the nexus between toilet paper and coronavirus, but I do see the nexus between all kinds of other issues, particularly supplies in the medical field, in the medical area, like ibuprofen, for example, like other things that could minimize the impact of the virus on individuals that may not be available thanks to folks who have bought up more of those than their personal use. The fact is, yes, we are free. Businesses are right to make their own decisions. But at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And as a city, when we get into these emergency situations, people rely on us to ensure that we're responding appropriately. And part of that is ensuring that our community is as healthy and able to treat themselves and prepare themselves as possible, and that all the resources aren't available only to a select number of people. For that reason, I think it's important that we have a conversation as the city about what the appropriate availability of particular supplies should be, how we might limit them to personal use so that your elderly neighbor or mine or someone else who's at risk and immunosuppressed is not unavailable to find their critical medication or critical needs because someone who's not as needy has hoarded those and might not ever use them. So for that reason, I would oppose this amendment. I think it's something we can work through. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and one that we can come back and change here at this body if we so choose. But Councilor Bassan, I want to give it back to you to respond.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think it's, so I agree with all of you, which might come as somewhat of a surprise. So I'm willing to say, hey, what if we changed the language of this to say, encourage limiting the kinds and quantities of items? I think that that would be a way that the city can still have their availability and their discretion and recommendation, but this would be something that we can try to keep the calm. We can try to encourage businesses to follow in this way, because I agree that there are people making poor choices that are costing and making others have to sacrifice that are in a higher need. But again, I think that this is going to open us for risk in other areas when it's in regard to private business and private property. However, if we can encourage limiting, then I think that that's something that might be something we can all agree on could be beneficial.
Councilor Benton.
Yeah, I appreciate the thinking there, Councilor Bassan. However, this is about proclamation of emergency orders and not emergency encouragement. I think any of us, any leader, elected leader, can give encouragement. However, I also agree with your concern about the breadth of this language, and I don't see why this. Here's where I'm coming from. On Sunday, there was an extensive story in the New York Times about people who are hoarding and gouging, hoarding for the purpose of gouging people. And one gentleman in Tennessee had basically gone around 3 states and bought up every single hand sanitizer or wipes that they could find, with a focus on going to rural, what he called backwaters, right, where people live, right? And they're going to a dollar store at these places and cleaning the shelves out of every one of these products, having already found them empty in the larger cities. That is what we're dealing with. I wanted to ask Mr. Melendez, or whoever may know about this, but our state attorney general has stated that he wants reporting on gouging and this type of activity. Does he have the powers to do that? Yeah, Mr. Melendez or Mr. Esquivel?
Mr. President,
Council
I
President
guess-
Davis, Councilor Benton, could you please repeat the question and then?
Yeah, just the Attorney General has kind of put out a marker about price gouging and this type of activity for you know, massive profit to take advantage of an emergency. Had you not followed
I mean,
that?
yes, there is guidance from that is available from the state. I think that the Unfair Practices Act covers a lot of what you were explaining. If you had another specific question, I haven't reviewed any Attorney General
Yeah,
opinions,
I
but-
was just curious under what authority the Attorney General would enforce that.
Well, I mean, in a health emergency, it's a different situation, but ordinarily the Attorney General has powers available to him to address that situation. So if you have a specific question, we're happy to look into and answer it, but.
No, just, it's a part of the general discussion on this item. But what I would say is that, and in this case of this guy who's got 14,000 items in his garage, he was actually stopped by eBay and wherever he was selling it. You know, they actually finally flagged it and stopped allowing him to sell it at astronomical profit margins. But this is just another idea, and you already have an amendment on the table, Councilor Bassan, but I think this was really intended, this was brought forward having to do with medical, health, and sanitation products. And I think, you know, that would be how I would try to define this and limit the items that we're talking about under this provision. But that's just putting that out there for the council's discussion.
Is that an amendment?
Well,
No, the medical.
it would be, Councilor Bassan has an amendment on the floor right now.
Councilor Benton, you could always make an amendment to the amendment. If it's okay, let's finish the discussion and
Yes,
see if we want to come back to that, if that's okay. Councilor Gibson is next, and I think maybe Councilor Borrego. No? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President. I heard that same story, and it was really sad. Somebody was taking advantage of people who, you know, didn't have easy access to some of the products that he was trying to gouge them for. And that is a problem, but that's not the only motivation for overbuying at the store, you know. Every time somebody goes in and, you know, takes massive quantities away, that means that someone who's going to be coming in later on is not going to have the same options. So I think that the wording that we have in the floor sub is good. I don't think it's too restrictive. I think it's clear, and I think it's enforceable. So I won't be supporting the amendment. Thank you.
Thanks. Next up, I have the administration and Mr. Aguilar, whoever wants to take this question, I think. Would you want to weigh in a minute on what you think the the usefulness of this would be for the city administration in terms of our emergency planning and response?
Sure, Council President Davis and councilors. First, I just want to agree with both Councilor Gibson and Councilor Bassan that this is not a good time to encourage panic. We all already have a duty to encourage public responsibility and private responsibility. We have a duty already to encourage all types of behavior that makes life easier for each other and helps us take care of each other. That's not what this bill is about. We also have a duty to encourage people not to panic about this bill or the emergency declarations by the feds, the state, and the city of Rio Rancho and many other cities across New Mexico to come. With respect to this particular provision, I would just remind the council that this is not just about coronavirus. So you want to draft this as, I believe, not to be a mind reader, but that probably the idea behind this drafting was to provide for a wide set of possible public health emergencies. And while cleaning supplies and medical supplies may be what is up right now, that may not always be the issue at hand. So we do consider these emergency powers to be extreme and extraordinary, but I understand that you're providing for future mayors and future councils, and you have to think about that as well. We do support the language that exists already and not the amendment.
Thank you. Councilor Sena.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to kind of touch back on the medical supplies, you know, being immunocompromised, being a cancer patient, having gone through a bone marrow transplant. This is a pertinent issue that we should address and talk about, because it's not just the healthcare needs, it's not just the sanitation wipes that we'll be needing personally as patients, but also the people that are responsible for me being here today is my healthcare providers. You know, making sure that they have the resources that they need and ensuring that the stocks are there for them. We have to focus that this is an unusual time. This is an emergency time to act and to really be there to protect our most vulnerable population. That is our elderly, that's our grandparents, that's our parents, that's people who have lupus, it's the people who are immunocompromised. So I think that the limitation there is just something to consider. I just wanted to have a clarity about what was said earlier by Ms. Nair in terms of closing privately owned businesses. Can you kind of tell me more about what the states are doing in limiting those businesses? Thank you.
So Council President Davis, Councilor Sena, first, just by way of clarification, I think that the amendment on the floor only relates to, it's not everything that's on this piece of paper anymore, is that correct? It's only limit the kinds and quantities of items that a business may sell? Yep. But to answer the question, my understanding, and it does change from sort of hour to hour, is that right now in the state of New Mexico, in addition to the ban on mass gatherings, which is currently defined by the state, or was before I got here, at 100 people, there's also an order to restrict occupancy of restaurants and bars to 50% of capacity and 50% of seating. So those are what I know of now. I can tell you that in places from Paris to Pittsburgh, they're looking at closing restaurants for anything but takeout. So I believe that is sort of like the next step that folks are taking, and we do not know what else might happen beyond that.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Councilor Jones because she hasn't spoken recently, and then we'll go to Councilor Bassan to close. Councilor Jones.
My mic doesn't work. I appreciate all the comments that have been made here, but I want to point out one practical thing, which we seem to forget here, is the practical way that things happen. It says what we're trying to strike is order retailers to limit the kinds and quantities of items that a business may sell per customer per day. Remember, if someone thinks that they have to hoard toilet paper or sinus pills, they can go to every retailer in the city and get it. So what we're doing is not preventing hoarding and causing it. We are simply making it more difficult to hoard. And I believe it's very difficult for me as a governmental entity to tell people how much of something that they can sell. because I really don't think, it's very difficult for me to do that, and I really would like to see this be stricken. I understand it's a matter of number of votes, but it just, we are interfering in private business, and we're also interfering in people. Maybe it's someone who can only get to the store once every 2 months, and we're telling them that their family can only have 8 rolls of toilet paper when they go to the store. There are a lot of what ifs and unintended consequences that we're putting into this kind of legislation. So I will support the removal of B because I think we need to stop and think what we're really doing here. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Bassan to close.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a few things that I'd like to ask and also clarify as well. So I think that in regards to the extreme amount of hoarding that we're talking about, I think that it's really oversimplifying the concerns of a lot of the counselors here when we say toilet paper, right? We're talking medical supplies, we're talking cleanliness issues, we're talking food. Let's face it, there's plenty of memes that are going to teach us what to do if we run out of toilet paper. But at the same time, we're talking about life needs, and they're very important. So I think what Councilor Senna was saying, it's proving my point, though. If we put a limit on the kinds and quantities of items that a business may sell per customer per day, that's also potentially going to limit what doctors' offices and what their businesses. Some of these are private businesses. We could be leaving that door open for for the conversation and for the lack of clarity. And I realize that that's not the intention that's here, but that's exactly what could happen should we leave it so vague, which is what I think it is. I would like to ask Mr. Melendrez a question, please. Specifically, would this leave an open and available, would it allow the mayor to be able to limit the control of this and sale of guns and ammunition?
Mr. President, Councilor Bassan, I'll repeat the language that's within that provision. Order retailers to limit the kinds and quantities of items that a business may sell per customer per day. So what's implied here is that when the city declares a state of emergency related to the public health issue, that the orders that result from that declaration have to bear a rational nexus to the issues at hand. So in the instance that we're seeing before us, the issues at hand have been, as have been described by the councilor and is witnessed by many of us, the hoarding of food goods, the hoarding of paper goods, and the like. And so it's hard to make that link that you're suggesting. However, it's not explicitly prohibited.
And that would be part of the problem I have with it.
Councilor Bassan, I think the city attorney wants to respond as well. I think about statutory construction, I bet.
No, actually,
Okay.
Councilor President Davis, Councilor Bassan, I would also like to remind the council that the state constitution explicitly prohibits municipalities from enacting any, regulating any incident to the bearing of arms. And so the hypothetical that you posed would fall in that category. So that's not what, again, I would agree with Mr. Melendez. That's not what this language says. And if that action were to be taken, that would be problematic, and so.
Thank you, Mr. President, as well. I think that I hope for all of the people that are watching, and I believe there are probably many, please let that put your mind at ease, because we are not trying to enact any kind of new legislation that will take law or guns or ammunition away from anybody, and I think that is a big concern for a lot of what we've heard today. So I hope if we do nothing else tonight, that at least we can calm people down in that fashion. I do have a couple more comments, and then I still will urge you to help me pass this amendment to omit and strike through Section B. I think that it's important to recognize that the governor is what Ms. Nair was saying. The governor's enacting all of this. So many of these things that we're talking about, the governor's already doing for us. And I really think that we should be very extremely cautious on what we're going to be doing on a municipal level, and especially with the vague language as we've discussed here tonight. I think that is something that's incredibly important. And I would like to ask, hopefully there's an answer for it, particularly of the administration though, with the passing of this, and I think we've talked generally about it, but what are we hoping that the mayor gets to do immediately if we pass this floor sub as presented, so that we can know exactly what we're trying to really nail down for the completely immediate future to help out with the city?
Council President Davis, Councilor Bassan, the first and foremost thing we want to do is make the city eligible for any type of emergency funding, regardless of the source, whether it's the state or the federal government or any agency within that. And, there's just too many variations to know for sure that we can rely on someone else's declaration. Our number one goal with this work is to be able to have access to as many resources as our city might need to withstand what's happening.
Thank you, Ms. Nair. And I just want to say that this is coming up in one of the other amendments to address exactly what you said the immediate need is. So being that there's no immediate need, I know that it has been discussed amongst other counselors that we really review this once this peak of panic and all of the emergency pressing needs that we have. We want to go back and look at this ordinance as a whole to update it since it was created in 1968. And I feel like this particular line, we can really discuss and fine tune a little bit at later times, but for the time being, I still want to urge your support to strike, limit the kinds and quantities of items that a business may sell per customer per day.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan, for that close. Seeing no other debate, all those in favor of the amendment to strike item B, subsection B, say yes and raise your hand.
Yes. Yes.
I see 4. Is that right? All those opposed, say no and raise your hand. No. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That item fails. Councilor Bassan, item C is next, and I think it needs a line item tweak if we're going to move that. Is it page 4, line 20 now? That's
Yes,
now
Mr.
item
President.
C.
That is correct. Thank you, Mr. President. So I make a motion to pass Amendment C, floor sub 020-4, on page 4, now line 20. After the term venues, insert the language controlled by the city, so that this would read, ordering the closing of places of mass assembly, including but not limited to theaters, clubs, places of worship, live or telecast performances intended for a public audience, and athletic venues controlled by the city. This amendment adds language to clarify that the mayor only has authority to order the closing of city-owned facilities during a proclaimed public health emergency. The city does and should not have the right to take control of privately owned property and businesses. I think that this is another thing that the governor is doing just a fine job of exercising her authority, that we don't need to bring it down to a more specific level, telling residents what they can and can't do with their businesses or their private properties in regard to this.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. So that will be floor amendment number 3. Is there a second? I figured. Second. Councilors, other discussion on these items? Councilor Benton.
So I'll ask Mr. Aguilar and/or Mr. Melendez, again, having to do with state authority, and Councilor Bassan's argument that the governor's authority has a lot of overlap with this bill. The previous bill, I would imagine, and this amended version of emergency powers for the mayor. To what extent are we filling a gap that is necessary, and to what extent are we confusing who's in charge in an emergency in the state of New Mexico?
Council President Davis, Councilor Benton, just to remind the council, this is the local ordinance, and this allows, regardless of any of the orders that the governor issues of statewide, this allows the city the flexibility and the ability to be able to address city-specific incidents that frankly may or may not affect the entire state. And so that's why that language is in there, and that's I think it's appropriate.
Thank
Sure.
you. If I could follow up.
Let Councilor Benton finish.
But to what extent, I doubt we've done this analysis, which is what does concern me somewhat, is I realize that some of these are strictly of local concern, of municipal city concern, as opposed to statewide emergency powers of the governor. But Isn't there some overlap in this with the governor's authority?
Council President Davis, Councilor Benton, I would assume that there might be some overlap. However, this is critically important for the city to be able and have the flexibility during a health emergency to address these areas that that this amendment spells out.
I understand that that's the reason we're a home rule municipality. Thank you.
I'm going to take the privileges of responding to the question really quickly and following that up. I just want to give the example. I think, Councilor Benton, you're absolutely right. On a large scale, the Department of Health and the state have the authority to do this, and we presume they could do this at a very micro level as well. But we are unique in the city in that we do most of those functions of the state, health inspections, building inspections, fire inspections, that the state takes on in smaller communities. And so we do also need that flexibility. The reason I see this as being important, not that the Secretary of the Department of Health could not pay attention to every sort of minor outbreak in the city through the reporting system, but quite frankly, in a large-scale emergent outbreak, there's a lot of stress on the state system that's not designed to work mostly for Albuquerque because we take on those responsibilities. But more importantly, if there were a small outbreak of, say, hepatitis at a club on Central, for example, I think the city needs the ability to step in and take the appropriate public health action to prevent folks from being there the next night until we can employ all of the public health infrastructure that might be available from the state. So I think we have to think large and small. In big scale, like we're dealing with now, I agree that the State Department of Health has a good grasp now. But if we continue to see community outbreaks as other cities might not continue, if we ever see community outbreaks like other communities have seen that have been hotspots in a particular church congregation, for example, or a particular grocery store, for example, I certainly want our city to be able to step in when we identify that and not wait on the larger infrastructure that might be dealing with other parts of New Mexico. And so for that reason, I think it's important. But I want to go back to Councilor Bassan, who wanted to comment on our ordinance, and not seeing any other question or debate, this might be a close. I'm sorry, Councilor Senna will go next, but then Councilor Bassan to respond.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to say and clarify, is this the examples of hotspots that you were just talking about and the hepatitis outbreak at a club on Central, would that qualify under emergency, public health emergency? Because that seems like it's probably not going to be an actual, or even a mass place at a church. I think that there's a massive distinction that we're starting to cross boundaries between church and state at this point. If we're saying we're going to close places of worship on a city and a municipal level, in addition to the fact that we're talking about a public health emergency, which I don't see if there's an outbreak at a singular location, if that's going, is that what the mayor could enact if we pass this?
Let me try. Councilor Bassan, I think the language is written, says that one, it's an infectious outbreak, and two, that it presents an unusual, to get the language right, unreasonably strain the medical emergency service resources in the city. Again, I think you'd have to go to a pretty extraordinary level to meet that. But again, I think us trying to think of all the who, what, when, wheres, and whys that might bring this up is another one of those problematic places. And so I do appreciate your concern around, say, houses of worship or other things. I think those are important questions. But at the end of the day, I think if we treat every location equally, we can defer to the experts in the public health field to tell us which ones are appropriate and how to develop mitigation plans with them. That would be my response. I want to go to yours because I interrupted you, and then I will go to Councilor Senna.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that it's very important that we clarify that I do not believe that an outbreak at one club or in a hot spot of sorts will constitute a public health emergency. And because of the United States Constitution and our freedom of rights in certain degrees, we cannot be taking people's ability to have their private businesses, again, places of worship, that's church and state. That's another federal law that we're looking at crossing, even though it's an emergency. And I think this is just very extreme. And I mean, if we don't keep it controlled by the city, I think that we're crossing another boundary that is opening a massive door for unintended consequences to come and bite us, even though the intention here is really, really well done and strong. But I absolutely think that this is far too extreme.
Thank you, Councilor. I want to go to Councilor Senna, then we have staff comments from Mr. Melendrez and Director Mast from Environmental Health, and then we'll try to bring this one to a close and see where we land. Councilor Senna.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, you know, I appreciate the concerns of our liberties and the Constitution. We all swore that oath. But for us, in thinking about the city's unique needs, Albuquerque, and the reason why we love it so much, right, is that we are unique to any other city in New Mexico. And so being the epicenter of healthcare services for our entire state, having hospitals that treat trauma, and also having an international airport that a public health crisis, infectious diseases, I think that is what we're concerned about, is because we are this epicenter of healthcare, and many of the other cities rely on Albuquerque being that epicenter. So I think that for us, in evaluating our city's unique needs, and I think that the administration can also address this, is that that's our concern, is that the city needs to be able to respond fast enough if we are the epicenter of a disease, because we are that epicenter of healthcare as well. So I just wanted to point that. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Mr. Melendrez, I know you were the drafter for this legislation. I think there was some analysis that was determined on why this provision was included. Could you give us some of that? And then I want to invite Director Mass up to talk just a little bit about the difference between sort of the regular flu and the current epidemics and the things that we're discussing here.
Mr. President, as I think we've seen and witnessed through the state level and through the national level, a focus has been placed on the size of gatherings that are considered safe at this time in order to well, I won't characterize because I'm not the health expert, but we have seen that trend about the importance of doing that within our city. So that was the basis for that provision. And going into that provision, I don't think that the ordinance contemplates, just sort of thinking through a rational way to look at this question that you presented. The ordinance doesn't contemplate that the mayor or, this mayor or subsequent mayor, as I know we're considering all of those possibilities, would be able to sort of with the wave of a wand make this happen. It requires a consultation with the Emergency Management Department, and the Emergency Management Division sort of holds a place that stands in the middle of a number of agencies that are coordinating with one another, including the Department of Health at the state level and our Environmental Health Department here at the city. And so a determination that's made would have to come from a source, a factual source that has identified a threat that is significant enough to exercise these types of powers. So that's one check, is that there has to be a basis for it that is articulable and factual. And the second is that to the extent that a determination were made that this council, for example, were to disagree with because it was too small scale or the facts did not support it, then the ordinance does reserve the ability for the council to step in and do something about it at that point. I don't think that the language as drafted does contemplate a small-scale outbreak. The language as drafted talks about something that threatens the health and safety of the residents of the city cumulatively, or that threatens the availability of emergency services within the city cumulatively. And so likely a singular event would not be sufficient to trigger that. I think our system probably plans for those singular events. It's the large-scale, widespread event that is not expected or planned for, that these orders and proclamations would be geared toward.
Thank you, sir. And the administration had asked if we would ask Director Mass to come up and just tell us a little bit about there's been some discussion about whether the coronavirus is sort of more analogous to the traditional flu or some of these other pandemics. And could you tell us a little bit about the difference in sort of how we're addressing this compared to the normal flu? Is it the same? Is it different? How should we be responding?
Sure. President Davis, thank you for that question. I'll start with that I'm not an epidemiologist on this, but we do have some on my team, and we've been working to monitor this this outbreak for several months now, along with our partners at the State Department of Health, along with the CDC. So I'll give my best answer in terms of all the discussions that we've had. The common flu, as we know it, is actually a series of different viruses, and so they are similar to the coronavirus in that they are both respiratory illnesses. So the symptoms of that are very much the same in terms of how they exhibit. Also, the way that they're transmitted also very similar. there's two key differences in the coronavirus and the common flu. The first one is that all the statistics and the studies and the information that we have currently is that the coronavirus is a little more infectious than the common flu. In other words, it's the way that it's transmitted is happening at a faster rate, and it's a little more aggressive. The second one, which is probably a little more important to that, is because it's the novel coronavirus, because there's other coronavirus strains out there, because this is a new strain, there is no natural human immunity to that right now. In other words, we don't have a vaccine to it, and because there's no natural human immunity to it, our bodies aren't able to fight it off as quickly. So as such, that makes this much more of a, even though I would also remind the council that this year we also saw a rather extreme flu season with pretty significant numbers. But this is different in that the way that it's aggressive and the fact that there's no natural immunity, the consequences, the potential consequences of ongoing spread are much more severe.
Thank you, sir. Councilors, other questions on this item? If not, we'll go to Councilor Borrego, and then we'll go to Councilor Bassan to close.
I'm not sure who needs to answer this, but I do have a concern about places of worship, and I'd like to hear some more discussion about that, because I understand a lot of the places of worship, the Catholic Church, the Jewish synagogue, other places are closed, and they are at the directive of the archdiocese or whatever affiliation they have. So I'd like to hear some more about that, kind of crossing that line, and whether or not we are in fact doing that.
I'm looking at one of our lawyers.
Mr. President, Councilor Borrego, so, there's been focus on that particular provision, places of worship, but that's grouped within a type of use that all have characteristics in common. And that type of use is grouped within this provision to include any places of mass assembly, and then the bill goes on to list, the types of places of mass assembly that are possible, and that would include theaters, clubs, has been discussed, places of worship, performances, athletic venues, and so the bill paints with a brush that is blind relative to the nature of the activity happening at the site. It paints with a brush that focuses on the nature of a large gathering. And so in that sense, it's neutral. And so there's not any targeting of any particular type of use or activity, only in order to address the health safety issue that could result from the gathering.
So you're telling me that the language that's on page 4, number C, is basically, it's neutral enough that once this is over, we're not going to get sued. I mean, the city has not crossed that line. Are you telling me that?
Mr. President, Councilor Borrego, I would never make a promise that we're not going to get sued. But what I can say is that we've given this our best shot to think through that issue, and at this point are comfortable with that grouping.
Council President Davis and Councilor Borrego, I'm not a practicing lawyer anymore, but maybe because of that, I happen to recall the case that we all learned in law school, or at least the older lawyers like Don and me learned in law school, about this particular issue. So the Supreme Court has got your back on this. There was a case where a city tried to interfere with the Santeria religion, and they used the public health language to try to say, because there was slaughtering happening inside the place of worship, that it was unsafe for sanitary reasons. And what the Supreme Court came back and said was exactly what Mr. Melendres just said, which is there are laws that are facially neutral, and that those are acceptable, but if they're ever found to be used in a way that is targeting a religion, they are not valid. And so the Supreme Court has sort of carved that out. We all learned that in the first year of law school, and so I think, if a mayor or a council were to ever try to do that, you would be able to respond very quickly with your power to come back and revisit and take away that power. You would be able to do that with no question.
Great. Other questions? Seeing none, Councilor Benton.
Quick question for yourself, Mr. President, as sponsor. Why do we have the words "or telecast" in this provision? A live performance, anything with an audience, I understand, but it seems that telecasting would be important to go forward under this.
I'm going to defer that to Mr. Aguilar, who helped draft this section.
Council President Davis, Councilor Benton, the reason that was included was to address not only venues that are actually having live performances with a band or a person playing a guitar, as well as to address any situation where folks might, just like at a sports bar, display movies or videos or any other type of broadcast intended to disseminate that to the general public, where the general public would understand that and then congregate at that location. So that is why that language was clarified.
Thank you.
Thank you. But Mr. Aguilar, wouldn't that be covered by the number of people in an assemblage? That whether it's a telecast or a live performance, that we would control the number of people who are in there by the way this is written?
Councilor President Davis, Councilor Jones, I mean, it would depend on the circumstance and or the situation for sure, but that's the examples I just gave were hypotheticals. So, I mean, there's any number of situations and other circumstances where, you know, we would see that type or have seen that type of practice, so.
Yeah. And I might point out, I think, as I read this, Mr. Aguilar, just correct me if I'm wrong, but the including but not limited to starts to enumerate a list of sort of examples, but may not necessarily be inclusive. So they could be duplicative with mass gatherings. Is that right?
President Davis, that's right. That's
Thanks.
correct.
Councilors, other questions, other discussion? Councilor Bassan to close.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a few notes that I've been taking in response to some of the comments. I think that it's important to recognize that the airport is controlled by the federal government if it's an international airport, and I am concerned with and I could be wrong, but it's federal aviation, so I think that they're doing a pretty good job of maintaining control as best they can while still trying to get folks home. I am well aware that this is not the same as the flu, but this is still a virus, and we need to still make sure to count that 60,000 people died last year in our nation from the flu, and we need to take precautions, but I don't know if that should come at an expense of our liberties in our Constitution. I'm really not okay with that. And I have a question. At some point, let's say we didn't have this verbiage in here. Can the mayor go to the governor and ask for assistance in closing certain properties or getting some of the things that we're talking about here? Is there a method of communication where, you know, the municipality can reach out to the governor and say, hey, we have an extreme circumstance here. We have a public health emergency, even though the rest of the state might not have one yet, and can you please help us? Can you enact that and support us, or is that not an option?
If I might respond, Councilor, and I'll let staff respond on behalf of the mayor, but I think you're right about that, and I think we're in a good place right now with a good administration in Santa Fe and cooperative ones here. But just 2 years ago, I would have said no, we would not be able to pick up the phone and call Santa Fe and ask for assistance or rely on their help. They very much were not interested in helping the city of Albuquerque with many of our issues, and we were left alone. It's a reason they ask us to rely on our home rule powers more often, I think, than we should have. But that's one reason I think we need these local ordinances, because although we have the right people in Santa Fe right now, I think we've been in situations in the past where we haven't. But since it's a question about whether the mayor could or could not, I want to defer to the administration.
President Davis, Councilor Bassan, absolutely. I mean, the mayor could do that. Whether or not the governor would then in turn act is another question, and that's why it's important that the city retains the authority to be able to take action as needed without having to go through any extra hurdles if, you know, or having to delay a potential response. I think that's also something that's important to keep in mind with this legislation. So.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. I think that the same can be argued respectfully. I'm not necessarily talking about this administration, but the same can be argued for any administration, that perhaps we shouldn't be giving these authorities to the mayor because we never know who might be elected in the future. taking that breath that Councilor Gibson had talked about earlier, I think that I would really like to take a moment to say that the administration specifically said the number one thing they're looking for tonight at the very minimum is to be able to allocate and redirect funds. So I say, let's strike this. Let's revisit this when we revisit the rest of this ordinance so that we can actually move on to approving, getting what the administration is really looking for in order to get business done for the safety of our community. I urge your support.
Thank you, ma'am. Hearing no other discussion and that item having, that sponsor having closed, all those in favor of floor amendment number 3 say yes, raise your hand.
Yes.
1, 2, 3. 4, right? So 4. All those opposed say no and raise your hand. 5. So that amendment fails. Councilor Bassan, item D, I'm sorry, amendment D, which would be floor amendment number 4.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. So I make a motion to make a floor amendment D to floor substitute 02004. On page 4, strike lines 21 through 22, deleting section D. This would delete the section saying, order the closing of places of institutional childcare or education such as daycares, preschools, and private or educational institutions. I'm making a motion to strike this because this is an amendment that it removes added public health emergency powers for the mayor related to the ordered closure because education is within the purview of the state government and this is not the authority of our local municipality. And I realize that this is for extreme circumstances. But again, we are granting privileges to a municipality when we are crossing over jurisdictions that I do not think we should be doing. I think that we should allow for the state entity and for the school district, the school board, the governor again. This is crossing jurisdictions that I don't think is appropriate.
Thank you. So Councilor Bassan has floor amendment number 1. Do we have a second? I have a second from, I'm sorry, number 4, a second from Councilor Harris. Councilors, is there any other discussion on this item? Seeing none, Councilor Bassan to close.
I hope I'm not continuing to beat a dead horse here, but I really think that we're starting to just take back our liberties more and more and more. We're really getting restrictive when the administration is asking for more money at this point. That's what they want tonight, and I really urge your support.
Sure. I'm sorry, Councilor. Before you, I appreciate that. Councilor Sena wants to ask a quick question of the administration, if that's okay, before we vote. Councilor Sena?
Thank you, Mr. President. I guess this question's more to the Director, Ryan Mast, in thinking about the reasoning to close schools, can you kind of talk more about what the reasoning was in a public health perspective? Because, we closed all of the Albuquerque public schools. So can you give me some rationale as to why they had those closures? Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. President, Councilor Senya, thank you for that question. The rationale behind this is similar to the rationale that was put forward by the governor for the closing of the public schools in the state of New Mexico. A lot of the actions that have been occurring over the last several days is to take action to what they call flatten the curve. And when they talk about flattening the curve, infectious disease spreads at an exponential rate. And what you do is you take measures to create additional separation between individuals so that there's not as much spread, especially for an infectious disease such as coronavirus that we don't have the natural immunity to yet, we don't have vaccines developed for yet, so more people are susceptible to it. So the closing of schools, just like the closing of large mass gatherings, et cetera, and as you've seen over time, additional and more restrictive measures are all meant to keep flattening that curve. In other words, trying to curb how many people ultimately are going to get infected by this virus.
Mr. President, thank you for that, Director. And I just want to clarify that this is under extraordinary times that, such an outbreak would occur, that this does not ordinarily happen.
Mr. President, Councilor Senya, that is absolutely correct. A lot of the concern right now from an infectious disease component is the fact that because we haven't had time to develop a vaccine to this, folks who are most vulnerable to the consequences of infection for this will have worse consequences. And so to take these drastic measures is to actually try and curb that and reduce the number of people who are going to get infected in the first place, because there's no medical treatment to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor Senna. I know Councilor Jones wants to weigh in. I just want to say, just to point out, though, although this current epidemic doesn't seem to be impacting children as much as it is seniors, that's the inverse of so many of these others. And so I think it's important that we protect this provision for the outbreak that may require that type of work. Councilor Jones?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm so pleased that you just made that statement. So when we're seeing here, we can order the closing of places of institutional child care because of this specific virus or spreading disease, but you're saying that might not be the way it is in the future, but it's still in here, which means that if the mayor were to declare that this is an issue that falls within this legislation, they could still close, the city still could close places of institutional child care, or, I mean, which one are we going to do? Are we going to give the mayor the ability to do this, or are we going to give the state the ability to do this? I think we kind of just mixed that up with this one right here in some of our comments. So I think we're overreaching for the future. If this were to apply only to this specific incident, maybe we need to do all of this, but that's not what we're saying. We're saying this will continue just like the things that we're trying to change in the past history in this legislation. We have to take things out because they're no longer relevant. But will anyone go back and take this one out, or is it there to be abused in the future? I don't know. I'm not saying it will be, but it certainly, if it's in there, it will be. So I think we have some legislation here that's probably a little difficult to deal with in the future. Thank you.
Okay. So we have Councilor Borrego. Thank you, Director. We appreciate it. We have Councilor Borrego and then back to Councilor Bassan to reclose, and then we'll hit the next one. Councilor Borrego.
The issue that I have with this is jurisdictional. I mean, we have elected officials that are board members for APS. They are elected by the public to do the best thing for the youth, the children of our city. And in this particular instance, it seems like we're overstepping our bounds jurisdictionally, and we're without, I mean, I could see it if we were saying in consultation with the board, you know, or if we were also with the State Board of Education, but we're not. We're saying that the mayor has the authority to do this. And it concerns me because it seems to me like and it goes back to the issue of church and state, which I, you know, see that also as an issue that really concerns me because, again, I go back to the Archdiocese who made some, just in this week, decided to close all of the Catholic churches, or last week, I guess it was. So, you know, these things are very uncomfortable to me because I feel like I'm sticking my toe into a different pond and yes, we are trying to prevent the spread of this disease. Yes, that's very important. I understand that from a public health perspective. But if this was saying something in consultation with these jurisdictions, then I would be feeling a lot more comfortable right now.
Ms. Nair.
Thank you, Council President Davis, Councilor Borrego. Just to take a couple steps back on a couple of things. First of all, while the state does have primary jurisdiction over the public schools, there are a whole lot of other daycare facilities, and I believe that that's what this is really intended to cover, and even that's what it says. So that would be more within the province of the city. Also, you know, we do this kind of thing all the time. If a business doesn't pass inspection, if the fire marshal goes in and finds that the conditions are unsafe for childcare, those type of closures occur under city jurisdiction and have since the city was around. Also, you know, while I did say that our primary purpose is to get funds, I never said it was our only purpose, and it's not. We need, and we also need to act more quickly, given what's going on, than this council is able to do. And that's not a knock on council, it's just that's the way it's designed. And finally, just want to say it is a novel idea that a government that is bigger and farther away from understanding our local circumstances should have more control over a local emergency than we do, but it's just not one that we espouse. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilors, anything else? Councilor Bassan, close again.
Thank you, Mr. President. My apologies if I did say only. I realize that is not what the intention was, so I'm sorry if that is what came out. So that being said too, if we do it all the time with fire marshals and we close unsafe locations, then I think that this is kind of getting counterintuitive again, and we're kind of going in circles. We have elected officials, we have specialists, we have organizations, we have different jurisdictions. I think all of that has been made extremely clear. What I think we need to remember is that the point of what all of this discussion has been up to this point, and we still have more to go, is that there's a lot of questions. And we are now, and I realize this is time sensitive, I realize this is a fast spreading virus, I realize that we need to make decisions quickly, but we're making them so quickly when we all feel, some of us feel uncomfortable making these decisions. There's so many amendments, there's a lot going on, and in addition to that, we have no in-person public comment to actually hear from our constituents, their concerns, that we're really here to represent them. We're not here to make a decision just with our own opinion, but this is a lot that is happening right now with these decisions and with what we're doing, and I realize it's emergency circumstances, and I realize that we also have the authority and responsibility to be able to represent and make decisions on behalf of our constituents. But I really think that with these questions, as massive as they are constitutionally, and the fact that this time, maybe not next time, but this time all of these have already happened because the governor has shut it down, because the Archdiocese has made adjustments, because the Department of Education has closed schools. These have already happened this time. So let's step back, let's not approve this part, let's approve this amendment, and let's revisit it for next time, and let's revisit it soon. But right now, it's already happening, and some of us are uncomfortable. So I really urge your support in taking a step back and keeping our public safe, representing our constituents as they expect us to do, while still also being fair and cautious of creating law that we haven't really allowed the opportunity to set in all the way. I urge your support.
Thank you. All those in favor of amendment number 4 say yes. Raise your hand.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4. All those opposed say no. And 5 against. That amendment number 4 fails. Councilor Bassan on what would be floor amendment number 5.
Okay, so I make a motion to approve floor amendment number 5, or E, floor substitute 020-04 on page 4, strike line 23 through 27, deleting added section E. So this section states, order that places of private employment take reasonable measures as determined by each employer to minimize any exposures to infectious diseases or health risks to employees and customers by, for example, partial or full closures, or authorizing non-essential employees to work from home or take leave, or deploying social distancing protocols. I really think we should strike this because it is, it's ordering places of private employment to take reasonable measures to minimize health exposures, which is important, but this is so broad and so ambiguous. Who's going to enforce this? Are we going to go around to all of these different public places, and are we going to make sure, is somebody going to take the time do we have the budget to have somebody to even inspect this?
Councilor Bassan, I'm sorry, just to keep us processed together, first let's move the amendment before we come back to debate. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So on the floor, we have amendment number 5. Do we have a second? Seeing none. I'm sorry, Councilor Jones. All right, Councilor Harris will second it. So we're back on the amendment. I'm sorry, Councilor Bassan, I wanted to be sure we get that on the record the right way.
Thank you. I'm sorry,
if you
I
want to
got
explain
excited,
your
Mr.
amendment.
President. I think I just said it all, but I mean,
Great.
again, this is ambiguous, and I think this is really going to be very hard to enforce. So again, why put this forward when, even though the intention's there, I don't think that the actual legality should be.
Thank you. Councilor Jones.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Councilor Bassan, I agree that this is a little ambiguous and probably can't be anything be done to it, but most especially because the clause is still in place in parentheses as determined by each employer, which means we have no right to do it anyway because we've given it to the employer. So this is just language that gets printed, and I'm not going to fight on this one, but thank you, Councilor Bassan.
Councilors, take note of that strategy. Any other discussion on this item? Seeing none, Councilor Bassan to close.
I urge your support.
Thank you. All those in favor of floor amendment number 5, say yes and raise your hand.
Yes.
That's 2. All those opposed, say no and raise your hand. That's 7. Did you get that, Ms. Ortega? Thanks. Councilor Bassan for number 6. You might get some.
Thank you, Mr. President.
You might get this one.
I'm going to need another bottle of water. I was just teasing. Thank you. So I make a motion for floor amendment number 6, or F, to floor substitute O-20-4. Thank you. On page 4, line 31, after the term appropriations, insert the following: not to exceed $1 million unless otherwise approved by the City Council. So for the clarity and purposes of the public, I want to make sure to read this. It says this clause is F: cancel city-sponsored events and gatherings, cancel or impose limitations or special protocols for the provision of city services and the use of city facilities, and authorize the redistribution or rededication of city resources and budgetary appropriations, not to exceed $1 million unless otherwise approved by the City Council as necessary to help address or combat the proclaimed emergency. You know, I realize that we need more funding, as we've discussed earlier.
Yep, we'll get it.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Councilor Jones. For the second, go ahead to explain your bill or your
Just
amendment.
rattling
You're
on
good.
and on. Thank you. So this amendment requires any redistribution by the mayor of the city, budget appropriations to respond to a proclaimed public health emergency. It'll be limited to a maximum of $1 million without approval of the City Council. The intended budget check and balance authority of the City Council should continue during an emergency situation. So as discussed earlier with some of the other councilors, I think that, you know, we do need to have some emergency funding available, and what's currently in legislation is $100,000 is the limit for the mayor, and I can recognize that, especially in extreme circumstances, that is really, I probably can venture to guess, not even a drop in the bucket with what we're going to need. So I think that to be able to have some kind of cap, it will allow council enough time to convene in order to make some amendments or approve more funding if necessary.
Thank you, Councilor. I have Vice President Gibson and then the administration, and then we'll see where else we go.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, Councilor Pizan, I just want to make sure the placement of this. This is letter I, and it's going to be inserted at line 9. Is that correct?
I think actually, Councilor, on the new version, it's line 28 and item F.
Oh, okay. So I was looking at the newest version. Okay, all right, all right. So let me just say, I like this one. I'm going to vote for this one. So I think it's easily defendable, and thank you for bringing this amendment. Thank you.
Hearing that, any comment from the administration?
Thank you, Council President Davis. Again, seeing this for the first time, do just want to clarify, since we do have some new councilors, that the contract approval authority is limited to $100,000, but our ability to move lines within the budget and things like that are under different rules that I won't go into in great detail. And certainly, it's within your purview to put a cap on it. I do want to point out that in a circumstance like this, $1 million isn't that much either. So, for example, if we wanted to move money from my office, well, I don't have $1 million in my budget. That's a bad example. If we wanted to move money from a program that we considered non-essential to buy 2 rescues, we couldn't do that with under $1 million. So, just wanted to make sure everybody had those 2 bits of information.
Let me respond, and then I'll go to Councilor Jones as well. Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think this is not contemplated that we'd be buying emergency equipment without some type of public conversation. And again, I want to go back to the fact that the council can call an emergency meeting if it's life-threatening, and 3 counselors or more could call a special meeting, which I think we could do. City Ordinance 21116 prohibits the mayor from changing the city budget by more than $100,000 or 5% of any line item without the approval of the council. I realize there's a lot of flexibility in that in terms of some of those line items like police overtime and payroll, neighborhood policing, for example, are huge and would allow more than that. But I think the concern being that I see the councilor's point here. I think I probably support this as well. At least that it gives the mayor some early flexibility to get started. And as we get into a large-scale piece, certainly to be sure that we're including the city council so that we can all be on the same team in the same direction and don't end up in a budget quagmire later, particularly if we're going to start losing GRT or other things. But I want to go to Councilor Jones and then perhaps back to the sponsor for a close. Councilor?
Thank you, Mr. President, and I just wanted to assure the CAO that, of course, the City Council can call a meeting at any time if it becomes an emergency, and we can, if necessary, reissue or issue more money. But I think to leave it open-ended would be rather foolhardy on our part because we are the ones who are ultimately responsible for appropriations of money.
Thank you. Other discussion? Councilor Bassan to close.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that those comments say it all, and I urge your support.
All those in favor say yes, raise your hand.
Yes.
Any opposed? So that's 9-0. That item carries unanimously. You got one. Congratulations. You're good. Councilor Bassan, floor amendment number 7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Floor amendment, and I would like to make a motion, and this time I'm going to get it right. So floor amendment number 7, or H, for floor substitute 02004, on page 5, strike lines 6 through 8. No? Did I skip one? Oh, I'm
G.
sorry.
G.
You guys almost got lucky.
G.
Okay, let's start over.
I think it's
All right.
5, line 1.
What's that?
Go ahead.
Okay, so we're going to do, I'm making a motion for floor amendment 7, or G, thank you, for floor substitute 02004. On page 5, lines 1 through 5, strike the language "or agreements for the city's use of non-city owned property outside the usual requirements for city real property transactions prescribed ROA 1994-521 as necessary to help address or combat the proclaimed emergency." I am hoping that this would, in the end, say, enter any agreements authorizing the use of city-owned property by third parties.
And we have floor amendment number 7. Is there a second? From Councilor Harris. Could I ask a clarifying question of the sponsor before we move further into debate, if that's okay? Is it your intent to only limit this to the mayor's ability to authorize the use of city property, say by the hospital or by some other, or the county or somebody, but not to allow the city to, say, engage in a lease to take over, say, a warehouse that we need for staffing supplies, for example?
So, Mr. President, my concern with this, with the way I read it and several others have interpreted it, is the key part that really concerns me is outside of the usual requirements. What does that mean? I mean, and to me, that's extremely vague, and we're in here, it talks about private property. And due to that vague nature, I think that it's, again, highly concerning.
I'm going to go to Councilor Jones, our real estate expert.
Thank you, Mr. President. And having participated with real property on real estate transactions before, we won't live long enough to get anything done if it has to go through real property. So, therefore, I'm a little uncomfortable with ambiguity, but absolutely comfortable with the justification for this one. So, Councilor Bassan, I have no problem giving it a try. And again, we have the power to come back and take it away if it turns out to be misused.
I think I agree with Councilor Jones. Councilor Borrego.
I would like to hear Ms. Nayer's thoughts. And I have had successful encounters with real property. Councilor.
I'm gonna let Mr. Rael answer this one for us.
Mr. President and members of the council, the process that's required by the city council as it relates to entering into agreements to use third-party property or to use private property requires not only a negotiations with the property owner, but if we're going to acquire the property, it would require an appraisal, which requires up to 45 days of review, and counter appraisals between the property owners and the city, according to state law. So that in and of itself may, quite frankly, surpass the emergency that's at hand at the moment. The other issue is, quite frankly, that if we're leasing property that we need to lease immediately, right now the requirements are we have to come to the council, and I believe that the numbers are less than $10,000. So at the end of the day, you all would go through your processes. Again, it might the issue at hand may be over by the time the council acts. So this is a way to, and this is not, again, not an issue as a council, but just the way the cumbersome nature of the way the real property ordinance is written right now, that we don't have that authority to do that. So this would give the mayor the opportunity to use a warehouse that is available on an emergency basis to house whatever might be needed at the moment. And yes, we could come back to the council when that lease was done to review and to explain to the council what occurred. So this is just giving us another tool, if you will, so that we can address any emergency that may come up.
Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Rao, so please do me a favor. So do me a favor. With the beginning of everything you said, it was all about all of the requirements that are necessary. There's a requirement for negotiations, there's a requirement for a contract, and this particularly says outside of the usual requirements. So aside from all of that, I agree that in this emergency situation, warehouses might be needed. We might need more facilities. I agree that is something there, but all of the safe things that you just said, I'm concerned. Will there still be negotiations with private property owners? Since we're now going outside of the usual requirements, is a big concern I have.
Mr. President and Councilor, unless the city attorney tells me differently, the mayor can't simply just go in and take someone's property as a property right. There would always have to be a negotiations with the process, or with the property owner. The process I'm referring to is the process by which we normally operate whenever we're trying to get private property, and what is required by you all through the ordinances for real property acquisition or real property leases, which is again can take anywhere from 2 weeks at the very best to 3 or 4 months at the very worst.
Councilor.
Thank you, Mr. President. So for all the people watching, Mr. Aguilar, will you please confirm that, because this is another big concern that has come in through a lot of emails, is the seizure. And I have never used eminent domain, but I've heard it and people are talking about it. So again, adding to some of that calm that we need to do, can you please confirm for the public that the mayor would not, even under these circumstances, be able to go to private property and demand without any negotiations with that property owner use of their property?
President Davis, Councilor Bassan, this language does not provide the mayor the authority to take or dispose of property. I think this language specifically addresses the use of city-owned property to provide the city with flexibility to be able to use that as the situation develops and as the situation requires. So yes, in this, again, to ease the folks at home, this is most similar to like an easement or a right-of-way where you might have access. I mean, this is not in any way disposing of any property. This is would not implicate the takings clause, so this is not problematic.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. With that, I would like to withdraw this amendment.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. Floor amendment number 7 is withdrawn. Moving on to Councilor Bassan for floor amendment number 8, which is item H in your packet.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a motion for floor amendment number 8, or H, floor substitute 02004 on page 5. Strike lines 6 through 8, and on page 5, delete added section H. So this would delete this section that says, issue such other orders as are eminently necessary for the protection of life and property throughout the duration of the emergency, including any provisions above that have not been previously invoked.
Do we have a
second
second?
that.
We have a second from Councilor Jones. Thank you. Councilor Bassan to explain your amendment, and then we'll go, I think, I'd like to go to the staff or the administration or the Mr. Aguilar to sort of explain the legal backing here. But Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. So this amendment would remove the added public health emergency powers for the mayor related to general orders necessary for the protection of life and property. In and of itself, general orders is extremely vague. And this seems like a catch-all that if any of the above were unchecked could give potential blanket authority to the mayor during this said emergency.
I see Mr. Aguilar wants to respond, I think, or perhaps Mr. Melendrez, since he was a drafter, either one.
Yeah, I mean, I will defer to Crit.
Thank you, Mr. President, Councilor Bassan. So the intent behind this particular provision is that it's hard to contemplate all of the types of emergent needs that could potentially happen in any given scenario. So a lot of ordinances will include a catch-all that gives that level of flexibility. And so that's what this provision does. It proposes that that additional measures may be taken that are not enumerated within the list in order to combat whatever emergency has been declared, and also clarifies that to the extent that those orders are taken, that they would last throughout the declaration of that particular emergency.
Mr. Aguilar, for
Yeah,
comment.
President Davis, Councilor Bassan, just to clarify, this language already exists in the emergency powers ordinance that is in place right now. What this does is this is essentially this paragraph G, or whatever it is now, was taken and copied and transferred over to the new enumerated public health order. So it's exactly the same. I completely agree with Mr. Melendez,
Yep.
and I'm happy to answer any other questions. But again, I think this is not problematic to our office at all, and think is necessary, and it already exists in the current ordinance.
And as the sponsor, let me just say, I think, thank you both for clarifying that. I think I also want to remind us that the provision that allows us to come back and sort of make those emergency changes is important, but it's pretty standard. I know that's not always the best answer, but it is kind of standard to have this provision when you're dealing with emergencies, because you never know what comes up. The ability to, God knows what, at least on a short-term basis, until you have a chance to present it to the public or the city council, can mean the difference between life and death in a critical emergency. And we certainly don't want someone to have a solution in front of them and not be able to do it because of some arcane provision in city law that we've heard about tonight. So, other discussion? Councilor Bassan to close.
Mr. Aguilar, is it page 4? That's what we're talking about right now. No, page 4, section G that you're saying is where it already exists?
Mm-hmm.
Just to clarify.
Yes, Councilor President Davis, Councilor Bassan, yes, correct.
I still think it's very vague. I think that this is super vague, and I urge your support.
Thanks. Councilors, all those in favor of amendment number 8, say yes and raise your hand.
Yes.
2, 3. All those opposed, say no, raise your hand.
No.
6, right? Okay. That amendment fails. Councilor Bassan, item I, which I believe will be floor amendment number 9.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a motion for floor amendment number 9 to floor substitute 02004.
We have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? I think this makes sense. But Councilor, you want to explain your amendment? I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. For the record, I wanted to just read it for
Please.
those that aren't here. So on page 5, line 15, strike the term president of the city council and replace with city councilors. I think that it's fairly obvious. I mean, we should have a majority vote like we always do.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilors, any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Any opposed? That item carries unanimously, 9-0. And Councilor Bassan, I think we're on the last of your packet, which is packet J, item number now 10. Floor amendment number 10. Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will also confirm it's the last one. Thank you. So I make a motion to approve floor amendment number 10, or J, of floor substitute 02004. On page 6, line 18, replace the term shall be with may be, but something that wasn't added in here that I did request is also upon due process. And I do think that that's important that we get in there. So if I may read this and then go for a second, or shall I
Go ahead.
wait the
Yeah,
other
read
way?
it in the record.
Every person remaining present at the place of any riot or unlawful assembly after they have been ordered to disperse by the police or any other lawful authority, or who fails to comply with any order or directive set forth pursuant to this ordinance, except those public officers and persons assisting them in attempting to disperse the same or comply with an order or directive or administer emergency services, may be deemed guilty of a violation upon due process.
We have a second from Counselor Jones. Counselor Bassan, can I ask the staff to a technical question?
Yes, please.
Mr. Melendrez, would you clarify for me the difference in when we talk about criminal law, for example, the necessity of the shall clause and who the determiner of facts is there?
Mr. President, if you look throughout the city ordinances, the enforcement provision would, without exception, say language that is exact to this, that a person who violates whatever provision it is shall be deemed guilty. And the reason for that is that a criminal law needs to be written with sufficient specificity to ultimately be enforced. And with a change from a shall to a may, that could potentially eliminate the enforceability of the ordinance because it's no longer expressed as to what action is punishable and whether or not you would be punished.
And Mr. Melendrez, to follow, I'm sorry, Counselor, let me finish that really quickly. And so using the shall language says this, it is a crime to violate this rule or this law. A police officer cites or arrests a person for that. The determiner of fact or the trier of fact is a judge or jury who determines whether that person actually did so, right? But the shall creates the crime itself so that the officer can take those actions for probable cause.
Mr. President, that's correct, subject to the prosecutorial discretion of the officer.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Counselor Bassan, I wanted to clarify those two technical points. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. So if we were to leave shall be, but still add on to the very end of that upon due process, does that still not apply because it's civil versus criminal?
Mr. President, Counselor Bassan, due process would absolutely apply, and that applies whether or not we state it here or not. That's a constitutional requirement. And again, the ordinances that we have on the books would not specify that due process is followed, because if we don't follow due process as a city, that tendency to get the city in a lot of trouble. And so the constitutional requirement is that due process would be followed from the time that any person is encountered by an enforcement officer of the city throughout the entire prosecutorial process up to adjudication by a court.
So really, it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters. I don't mean to say it like that,
Mr. President,
but
Counselor Bassan,
people will get due process.
It does matter, and I understand the kind of impulse to want to put it there. I would suggest not, because if we start putting it in some places and not in others, it could create a strange implication. And when it's the law of the land regardless, I think it's safe to leave out, and I think your concern will be satisfied.
Thank you, Mr. Melendrez, and thank you, Mr. President. With that, I will withdraw my amendment.
Thank you, Counselor. So floor amendment number 10 is withdrawn. Counselors, that puts us back on the floor substitute as amended. Is there other debate? I know we've had a lot, but we've just gotten started. Counselor Vice President Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I, and I'm sure everyone else, got an extraordinary amount of email, not all of which was, I can almost remember the subject line. But we got a lot of other email, and I haven't even been able to look at all of it because it was lost in the hundreds of others that all had the same subject line. But I guess my point is this, that this is a big step forward, and I do support this. However, I would feel better about this if we were able to better communicate what we're doing here. There's a lot of misinformation besides that one email that came out in hundreds. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I posted something today earlier on Facebook, but that's just like a drop in the ocean, really. So I am respectfully going to move deferral on this so that we can have some conversations about that. You know, we're looking at sort of the first wave of this with all the closings that have happened so far. You know, the governor has certainly proven to be very decisive on this going forward. I think that we can probably put this off until our next meeting and have a chance, particularly since we have not had people here in the audience. So I'm moving for a deferral.
Councilor Gibson, do you have a deferral until our next meeting, which would be April 6th? Is that right?
Mr. President.
Just a second, I want to, just to clarify, I'm sorry, Councilor Gibson, is it April 6th that you're moving a deferral to our next
Yes.
regular scheduled meeting?
Yes.
Sorry.
April 6th.
I have Councilor Senna and then Councilor Benton. No. Councilor Senna's passed. Councilor Benton.
When I asked staff, we're not going to have public in that meeting either.
Mr. President, Councilor Benton, there are a lot of factors that go into that question, including the declaration by the governor about the public health emergency, any federal declarations, the determinations by the city as to whether or not this building should be occupied in that manner, the determination of the president of the city council. So, I mean, that's 3 weeks away. And so there's a good chance, I guess, just based on the history and the facts that we know that the scenario will continue, and that may continue to be the case. But there would be some determinations that would need to be made. If I can really quickly, Councilor Gibson, with respect to your motion, you've deferred it to April 6th. And so that presents the absolute that the council will hear the bill on April 6th. And so if for consideration, it may be more appropriate for purposes of your motion to defer to the next meeting of the city council. Yeah. And in that event, if your motion does pass, it would give the opportunity for the council to call a special meeting if necessary, without having to wait the 3 weeks as would be required under your present motion.
So, Mr. President, if I may, I'm willing to do that, yes, and if there's a meeting before that. My whole point really is just this, so that counselors up here will have more of an opportunity to answer emails and have the conversations that we just haven't been able to do, and hopefully, you know, bring everything down a couple of notches. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Gibson. I want to respond to that, but first, Councilor Senna was first, and then I'll respond.
Thank you, Mr.
Councilor
President. I think this question's more for the administration. Say if this deferral were to happen, would the Emergency Operations Center or the Emergency Management Services have the resources to address the infectious disease if it were to become very critical?
Thank you. Thank you, Council President Davis, Councilor Senna. The issue is we just don't know. 2 weeks ago, we were sitting here, and our biggest problem was that getting the Little League leases approved. Now those Little Leagues aren't even allowed to play because of how quickly this public health emergency has evolved. So I can't say for sure no. I can't say for sure yes. And everything points to that, as Director Mast said, this sort of curve, and we are still on the upswing of the curve. So there's no reason to believe things are going to be better on April 6th.
Councilor Harris.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I was actually going to vote against the bill because I don't think it's narrowly tailored enough. I think that's sort of the constitutional language that we use. I do not believe that the mayor was acting in bad faith or was trying to exceed his powers. I don't believe there's any motivations for this bill other than public safety. I just thought it was too broadly done, and we had an opportunity to narrow it. I think I'm going to vote against the deferral because I think we need something in place between now and 3 weeks, because 3 weeks in the course of this this pandemic could be a lot of time, because I've heard some people have said we're only a couple weeks behind Italy. And if we have an Italy situation in 2 weeks, then we're going to wish we'd done something. So what I was hoping that we do is actually to hold a special meeting within a week and come back and then come up with something that has a little bit more consensus to us. But I don't think we should wait 3 weeks to have something on the books.
Thank you, Councilor, and I appreciate that. And Councilor Gibson, I appreciate yours. As I was just mentioning to you, I understand the desire to sort of wait a minute and see if we can get more community consensus. I think, and I'll take responsibility for that. I think some of the early drafting of this legislation was lumping in, as the Journal sort of said today, the new public health sort of definition into the existing law. And I think we found that people were concerned about that. I did not share the concerns that, as Mr. Melendres has articulated a number of times tonight, that one could find a nexus between some of the, for lack of a better word, like a riot control provisions for the need to clean a community center. But I understand that some folks could see that, and that with the wrong people in office, that would be the case. And so we've tailored a legislation that specifically creates a new section of law with the specific tools we need to address this. But the fact is, this crisis is, quite frankly, imminent, perhaps here. I don't want us to wake up tomorrow morning with the community testing that's going on, the drive-through testing. We've seen the emergent cases that have come have been mostly clustered here in Bernalillo County. And we've done a good job so far with the tools at hand. But if tomorrow morning we wake up and the number of cases has accelerated, either because of testing or because of unintentional community spread, because somebody didn't wash their hands or didn't pay attention to the rules, we will have an emergency meeting, and we will be back here to decide how it is that the city is going to respond outside of the limits of the sort of the limits that are put on it by current law. That said, I think this law is good. We've gone through now 10 amendments, 2.5 hours of discussion and debate, lots of look and comment on this. It's important. This is something our city needs. We need to lead on this. We have never waited to rely on the federal government, particularly not lately, and certainly not anytime soon, as far as I'm concerned. And we've had disparate relationships with the state in terms of their ability to respond, their ability to pay attention to our issues in the level that of attention that we think they need. And quite frankly, we should not have to wait on someone else to take action, to take care of our community when we have that charge. I do think we can pass this tonight. I think if this council finds that if the mayor chooses to use this and wants to pull it back, we can have a special meeting. And if councilors want to come forward as this crisis evolves and offer other amendments, both for the other part of the non-implicated civil emergencies law or for this one, we have that option, and we can always call a meeting for that as well. But we are in the upswing of this. No one believes that tomorrow will be easier than today. And I think we ought to be in a place to give the administration and our community the tools it is that we need to respond. And so I would oppose any amendment to defer. I think we should pass what we have tonight. It's a good one. We've worked through those details, and that we should exercise our oversight authority relentlessly and deliberately in this regard, and that includes the ability to amend this ordinance at any time, subject to our rules. And so I would urge you not to support the deferral at this time. Is there other discussion on the deferral? Councilor Jones.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think one of the things that the people at home need to know, and everyone here, is that, again, the City Council is the ultimate decision maker on this, and we can call an emergency meeting at any time. Let's make that real clear. And if we see that we don't have enough money, or some of the things that we have legislated here are not right, aren't working, and need to be changed, or something needs to be added, we do have the ability to do that. So I think that's the name. This is a piece of legislation that is probably a living piece of legislation, and it will be changed, I am confident, before we're finished with this, even in the next 30 days. So just have patience with us. We're doing the best we can. There are things out there that we don't even know about yet that we might have to change legislation or add legislation. So I think I think this is the best that we can do at this point in time, but I don't think it's probably the final piece that we can do. Thank you.
Well said, ma'am. Thank you. Councilor Borrego.
Well, I think the issue here is that there is a public health crisis, and there is an urgency to do something. And I think that the city council has the responsibility and the duty to, ensure the health, safety, and welfare, general welfare of the public. That's our responsibility. And while I have some questions, and I stated what some of those things are, we've sort of taken the elephant off the table in terms of the Second Amendment. So that's not an issue anymore. And I think that's important that the public understands that that's not part of this bill any longer, because I think that's what that stack of emails was that we got, which I think I had like 1,000 at last count, and that was at 5 o'clock. So I think it's within our power to, adopt this at this point in time so that we have something in place. As Councilor Jones indicated, we could always come back. We can amend it. If there's, this is a moving target. And yesterday I saw a graph of the spread of this particular disease. And, if you had 3 people and then they infected 3 people and they infected 3 people, it can get very, very complicated. And I think we're already seeing the results of our community just by what we discussed here tonight in terms of people, hoarding and doing things that are probably not ordinary. They're not normal to our everyday life. And I think part of our responsibility is to minimize that, activity in our community. So by putting it in place tonight, that doesn't mean that we can't come back at a later date if it means in however much time it takes to advertise a public meeting, if that's 3 days or whatever it is, and advertise it in the newspaper. We can always come back and amend it if it's not working for us. So I think we have a responsibility. And so for that reason, I'm going to not support the deferral and recommend that we hear this or act on this tonight.
Thank you, Councilor Borrego. Next up, I have Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do realize that the trend is very rapid with this virus. So I think like every day we wait is something that's has the potential to escalate massively, potentially. That being said, I support Councilor Gibson's motion for deferral, but I hope that she would consider changing it to the special meeting of 1 week from now. Because really, even though we need to have these measures in place, even though we need to be able to, be capable of enacting these laws to protect our society and keep them, guess what? We're doing it already. The governor's doing it. We're already closing up businesses early. We're already mandating that they do things certain ways. We're already shuttering schools. I believe we do have time. We have 1 week. That I think that this is something that we should really offer the safety and security to our constituents who aren't here in person, and give them the opportunity to still contact us, give us the opportunity to chew on it so that we can feel comfortable voting when really, all the emails that came in all say vote no. So instead of risk just voting no if we're going to represent our constituents, let's actually give the opportunity for us to all combine and be united in figuring out a way to tell our constituents, this is why we really want to go ahead and support this. This is why we think this would be better. So I think that even though time is of the essence, we're already shuttering down. I believe, and I choose to believe, that we are getting ahead of that curve because of already the things that are being enacted by the governor, by the Secretary of Health, by the Department of Education, by all of these other entities. Then I realize that this needs to be in place for the future, but I think that we're kind of already doing it now to where we can at least have 1 week.
Thank you, Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Mr. President. I actually just want to Thank you, Councilor Davis, for bringing this forward. You know, we have a public health crisis on our hand, and I think as leaders of the city of Albuquerque that we have a responsibility to act. And I agree with Councilor Jones and others who have said that, you know, there's maybe some flawed legislation within this that we need to come back later on to look at. But for now, I think that we have a responsibility to the citizens of Albuquerque and just to assure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that everybody's safe and that we have things in place that will ensure that we look after our most vulnerable in our community especially. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Pena. I'm going to go back to Councilor Gibson for a clarification on her motion, and then we'll go to Councilor Jones and vote on the motion for deferral.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I would like to modify my motion. I'd like to move deferral until the next meeting, period, whenever that might be.
Thank you. And just to clarify, will we get a second on that? Second. Thank you. Councilor Jones.
Thank you, Mr. President. And interestingly, I appreciate what everyone has said about the mass number of emails that we got, which incidentally all said the same thing. So I can speak very clearly here and say that the major opposition to the ones that they didn't all say the same thing, but a good number of them. The major opposition was that we were going to take away their guns or not allow them to buy guns or ammunition. That is absolutely not in this, because I wouldn't vote for that either. And the fact that we are granting to the mayor emergency powers that perhaps he shouldn't have, when in fact the emergency powers that we are granting are absolutely under control of the city council. We have absolute control of the actions that are going on here. And so far I haven't seen, well, I have seen, but I don't think we're going to allow anything that is extraordinary or shouldn't happen that would be harmful to our citizens. And we just need to understand that we can't, this isn't one that we should play politics on. We need to do what we think is right for the city. Each one of us has to vote what we think is right, and that's what I plan to do.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Gibson, do you have anything further on the close for the deferral, or we'll move to a vote? So all those in favor of the deferral until our next meeting say yes and raise your hand.
Yes.
Yes.
2. All those opposed say no. Raise your hand. No. That motion fails. So we're back on the bill as amended. Is there any other discussion? I kind of did my close already, but Councilor Benton.
I have 2 amendments that
Yes,
are
sir.
based upon Councilor Bassan's amendments. So going back to page 4, lines 16 through 17. This would be number 10. This was your amendment number 2, Councilor Bassan.
I'm sorry, for the record, this will be amendment number 11.
This would be number 11? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, right, sorry. This
I'm
would
sorry,
be number 11. And this would be on line 19 to delete the words places of worship, comma, live or telecast.
Second.
So we have a motion and a second for Councilor Benton's amendment that would delete places of worship, live or telecast performances. Councilor Benton, you want to explain your amendment?
Yes, I agree that, at least at this time, that places of worship should be exempt for reasons of constitutional protections, and that understanding that there are ways to slice and dice that, I think it sends a wrong message. This is including but not limited to, so why should we put places of worship in here? And the same thing, I do have a concern about whether something is telecast or not. If it's telecast and intended for a public audience, then that's freedom of speech. So that's my thinking on this.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. Can I ask a clarifying question, maybe of one of the lawyers? As Councilor Benton mentioned, the including but not limited to list sort of enumerates some but not all of the potential places. Removing these would still allow the mayor to have that authority but not explicitly to list those places. Is that what I understand? And then I want to ask if Councilor Benton, is that what you mean, or do you mean to
Yes.
exempt? Okay.
President
Even
Davis,
without this specific language, if,
yeah, and Councilor Benton, it would have that flexibility, so.
yeah. Great. Councilor Bassan, I'm sorry, Borrego.
I want to thank Councilor Benton for looking into that and amending that, because that is a huge concern of mine. So, thank you.
Great. Councilors, other discussion. Councilor Pena.
Counselor Benton, can you read the amendment again?
Yes, just on page 4, line 19, to remove the words places of worship, keep the comma, and delete the words live or telecast. I guess we could leave live performances and maybe just take out or telecast. That's sort of the, I think, the intention.
Okay, so, Mr. President, can I ask a question from our city attorney? What if we just remove that entire thing that said, just order the closing of places of mass assembly intended for public audience and, no,
Period.
this is, period, yeah, controlled by the city? No, that was her language that was added. For public, no, just for public audience. I don't have it. Okay. Can I borrow that? So what if we just said, order the closing of places of mass assembly?
Is that a question for the sponsor? Is it friendly
No,
amendment?
for the attorney.
I'm sorry.
Councilor Davis, Councilor Pena, could you clarify the questions you're asking specifically?
It's just that we're listing places, so it just seems as though if we said order the closing of places of mass assembly, period.
Mr. President, I would accept that as a friendly amendment.
And Mr. Aguilar, I think what the councilor's asking, if I could clarify,
Yeah,
is that that would have the same effect, but it would be cleaner. Is that right? Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mr. President?
Mr. Melendez.
Can I, just some context. So when we did not define what a place of mass assembly is in the bill. And so the reason for a list like that is to give a cue as to the types of places that the city would have in mind in exercising that authority toward. It's not intended to be exhaustive, but those examples would help interpret what was intended by that language, closing places of mass assembly. And so if you were to put a period after places of mass assembly, you would still be granting the authority to have those types of closures, but by eliminating the list, there wouldn't be as much context for what the city council intended when it passed the bill. That's not fatal. That's not an issue that would preclude you from doing what you're proposing to do. But I wanted to just point that out is the reason for why in some instances we would have a list of 4 examples.
So, Mr. President, but if you took out places of worship and live or telecast performances, then you would, and you just used other examples like theaters, clubs, athletic venues, rather than the place of worship? Or could you put a number to it?
Mr. President, I think, Councilor Pena, I think those are all options. You proposed the option of putting the period after assembly, and that's pretty clear. It's a clear amendment. I think that you have discretion as to whether to do that or to just take out the places of worship as live or telecast per Councilor Benton's amendment. And so my only point was just to kind of explain why we would have a list in some instances, but the list is not required, I think is part of my point as well.
Councilor Payne, you have a preference?
I would defer to Councilor Benton in terms of what he's more comfortable with. I think that maybe.
Mr. President, Councilor Pena, I was specifically concerned about live broadcast, which is not necessarily a place of mass assembly. And the protection of religious organizations under the Constitution. So that's what I was really aiming at. So I agree that your friendly amendment would simplify it, but I think Mr. Melendez makes a point. So maybe if all right with you, we'll go back to the my original
Mr. President?
motion.
I would still support Counselor Benton's amendment. And Counselor Pena, with all due respect, I think it makes it too broad if we leave it open, and I think we should give some examples. My particular issue, again, was places of worship. And I think that, we're overstepping our bounds.
So the motion on the floor to clarify is Counselor Benton's original amendment that would remove places of worship and live and telecast performances, or live or telecast. We're keeping performances intended for a public audience.
Correct.
Counselor, any other discussion on that? Hearing none. All those in favor of the counselor's amendment say yes.
Yes.
Any opposed?
No.
I heard one no,
Yes,
right?
no.
That's 8-1. Counselor, you have a second amendment?
Yes, Mr. President.
Number 12.
This would be amendment number 12. This would be amendment number 12, and this is actually lines 16 and 17 on page 4, line 16 and 17, this is item subparagraph B, to add the words between the words quantities of and the word item, to add medical health and sanitation.
Second.
Okay, so, Ms. Ortega, you got that? Just want to be sure. Thank you. I have a motion and 2 seconds. Counselor Ben, you want to explain, and then any other discussion?
Yeah, I mean, this is strictly having to do with health, and this public health emergency. These are typically the kind of things that we've had a run on, and we need to avoid hoarding.
Thank you. Other discussion on this item? I see Counselor Gibson, Counselor Sena, and then I might ask Director Mast, or I guess our emergency management folks. Director Mast, do you have any comment on whether that could be appropriate, or if there's other things that we might want to consider rationing, given your emergency management experience? Counselor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we're not talking about rationing here. And there's been empty shelves, not just for paper products and or medical items and sanitation, but canned goods and other things as well. So so I probably won't be able to support that. I just think that it would be so useful to have a mayor who would, if necessary, in times when, things are flying off the shelf, and maybe somebody doesn't get off work until 8 o'clock at night, and by the time they go, there's not what they're looking for. So, so I'm sorry I won't be able to support this amendment. Thank you.
Counselor Sena.
Thank you, Mr. President. I share the same sentiments of Counselor Jones. I won't be able to support it. Thank you.
Other comments? Counselor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that if at first you do not succeed, try again. But I do support Counselor Benton's amendment, in addition to the fact that this will make it very clear to those that are paying attention and very concerned that we can't use this to push any gun control measures, which I realize we clarified earlier, but this is one step further in helping with that.
Great. Counselors, other discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of the counselor's amendment number 12, say yes and raise your hand.
Yes.
I see 3, 4, 5, 6. All opposed? 3.
No.
That item carries. So Counselor, is that your last amendment? Yes. Great. So we are back on floor sub 04 as amended. I kind of did my close earlier, so any other last minute issues we haven't discussed? Seeing none, I'm sorry, did you have one? Oh, go ahead, Councilor Senna.
Just before we vote, I just wanted to say that these are for extraordinary times. This is for times that we actually have a public health crisis, which does not often happen, but when it does, we have to respond and respond quickly and take that leadership. We are trying our best to stay ahead, as we have stated before, to flatten the curve. And for me, I truly believe that we are being a leader in addressing these issues for the city, for our state, and for the nation, because we are staying ahead of that, because we are taking this leadership and being bold and willing to take, although these measures may be uncomfortable for us to think about and talk about, but we are taking this, we are being the leaders in it. And in the end, it is about addressing and protecting the most vulnerable. It's the elderly, it's the immunocompromised, it's cancer patients, it's your grandparents, it's our parents. And so I think it's critical to think about this. And at the same time, we understand, I think I could say for our counselors, that a lot of people are taking a lot of sacrifices and doing what they can to help one another. And that is really the spirit of Albuquerque. And, you know, we are doing all that we can, and Burqueños are doing what they can as well. I know that some counselors and other policymakers are also stepping up to fill these gaps, you know, buying groceries for our neighbors that are immunocompromised or elderly that can't or aren't mobile. So I just want to say that although we are taking these steps and it may seem, you know, uncertain, but we are there for one another. We're there for each other. Neighbors are there for each other, and we hope to be that support for our community as well. And I know and understand all the sacrifices that everyone's making, but at the same time, we see the real spirit of each other when we come in moments of crisis. So I do want to thank Councilor Davis for bringing this, and I will be supporting. Thank you.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Councilor Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. And in times like this, what we have with due process in general and constitutional rights, there's often a tension between public safety as well as what processes do and civil rights. So we have public safety, civil rights, and that's always a balance, and we're trying to find that balance. And I think the bill, frankly, went a little bit too far. I think it just sweeps in too much, and it creates a risk that perhaps our government could overstep. However, I want to be clear that I don't think there's any intention to do that. I don't think there's any malicious intent by any mayor, certainly not this mayor, to actually, you know, try to take more power for himself in order to harm people. That's just not happening. However, people do have a legitimate interest in making sure that our government stays within within the lines and colors within the lines. And I would rather see a bill that was started out much narrower, and if we needed to come back on an emergency basis and expand it, do that, rather than sort of the will of the council, which seems to be, well, it might be too broad, but we can always come back and cut it back. I'd rather go the opposite way. So for that reason, I'm not going to support this.
Thank you, Councilor Harris. Councilor Borrego for closing comment.
Having grown up in New Mexico, you know, we've always been good neighbors to each other. And I think that in times like this, which are really unprecedented, we need to continue to be good neighbors with each other and remember that we all live in neighborhoods. There are people out there that are less vulnerable than us. And there are seniors, there are children who are all having to live through these difficult times. And I think the one thing about growing up in a Hispanic family is if someone was, then probably many other families that are not Hispanic, if one group, one uncle, one aunt, somebody was having a difficult time, everybody pitched in to help them. And this is the time that we need to take to remember that we need to lend that helping hand and really be the New Mexico that we are. So, you know, we also need to help to calm fears. And I think it's really important, and it's something that all of us as counselors, we all have networks out there, and we need to remind our neighbors that those networks are in place. I think we saw that tonight with our different city agencies, and I want to commend them for being here tonight. So let's just all step up and get through this together and be the New Mexico that we are.
Thank you. Councilor Pena, then Councilor Bassan.
So I think I closed a little earlier, but I just wanted to say, just sitting here next to Councilor Sena, that she brought to light about Councilor Sanchez. She just said, "I truly believe." So.
I didn't even notice, but you're right. Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I agree with Councilor Borrego that we do need to be good neighbors and we do need to come together as a society. We do need to be there for each other. We do need to be kind. We do need to be calm. We do need to be rational. We were elected to represent our constituents, and at this point in time, the majority of what I have been able to go through on my contact and my emails, my text messages, my Facebook Messenger posts, my Facebook posts, the majority of constituents are telling me to vote no on this. And because I was elected and made a promise to them to represent them and what they want, I will be voting no for this.
Thank you, councilors. Seeing no other debate or discussion on this item, all those in favor of floor sub 04 as amended as an emergency ordinance, say yes and raise your hand. Yes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All those opposed say no. No. 3. That matter having passed and there being no further business, this city council meeting is adjourned. Councilors, watch your emails. I'm sure we'll have some new meetings coming.